The moon cast long silver shadows across the valley floor, illuminating the silhouette of a small girl as she dug into the earth with determined strokes. Her thin arms trembled with the effort, but her movements never faltered. Sweat mingled with tears on her dirt-streaked face, yet she continued her solemn task with the resolve of someone much older than her 12 years. Emma Sullivan paused only once, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear mountain air. The wildflowers surrounding her swayed gently in the night breeze, their sweet scent a stark contrast to the bitter task at hand. "There are promises that can't be broken," she whispered to the night, "even when death has parted us. That's what Mama taught me before she left." The hole wasn't large, just big enough for the leather-bound journal clutched against her chest. She held it for a moment longer, her fingers tracing the worn cover as if it contained all the answers she'd ever need. A large hand gently settled on her shoulder, and Emma didn't need to look up to know who it was. The touch carried both strength and a profound weariness that she had come to recognize over their journey together. "It's deep enough now, Emma," the man said, his voice low and rough from disuse. Emma nodded, but didn't immediately place the journal in the earth. Instead, she opened it to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, a purple lupine now flat and faded, but still beautiful. "Mama would have loved this valley," she said. It's exactly how she described it in her stories. The man knelt beside her, his tall frame folding awkwardly, and for a moment the moonlight caught his face, revealing deep-set eyes that had witnessed too much suffering and a beard that couldn't hide the scar running along his jaw. But there was something else there, too, a gentleness that few had ever been allowed to see. The scene shifted, dissolving like morning mist, as the words appeared. 3 months earlier. Copper Creek, 1887, Hararon. Jacob Reynolds stood at the bar of the Golden Nugget Saloon, staring into a glass of whiskey that reflected the dim lamplight in amber waves. The liquid burned going down, but not enough to silence the voices that haunted him, not enough to drown the memories of screaming men on blood-soaked fields, or the quiet rattle of his wife's final breath. At 34, Jacob looked a decade older. His once bright blue eyes were now permanently shadowed, his dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. His hands, surgeon's hands, that had once saved countless lives, now trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. The saloon around him buzzed with the usual evening crowd, miners, fresh from their shifts, their faces still bearing the dark streaks of copper dust. Gamblers hunched over card tables, and the occasional cowhand passing through town. The piano player in the corner hammered out a tune that was barely recognizable over the din of conversation and laughter. "Another?" asked the bartender, a mountain of a man with arms thick as tree trunks. Jacob nodded, sliding his empty glass across the scarred wooden surface. He'd arrived in Copper Creek 3 days ago, another anonymous stop in 5 years of aimless wandering. Every town was the same, a place to rest, to drink, to forget for a while, and then to move on, when the memories inevitably caught up. "New in town, ain't you?" The bartender set a fresh glass before him. "Passing through or staying?" "Just passing through," Jacob replied, the same answer he'd given in a dozen towns across the West. The bartender nodded, accepting the response without further question. In places like Copper Creek, a man's business was his own until proven otherwise. That was one of the few mercies the frontier still offered: anonymity, at least for a while. Jacob took another sip, feeling the familiar burn. He'd trained as a physician before the war, had served as a field surgeon during the bloodiest battles of the conflict, and had even maintained a small practice afterward. But that life had ended the day Sarah died, her body ravaged by consumption, while he, a supposed healer, could do nothing but watch. No, that wasn't entirely true. He'd done something in the end, something that haunted him more than all the battlefield amputations and bullet extractions combined. He'd increased her morphine dose that final night, knowing exactly what it would do, watching the pain ease from her face as her breathing slowed, then stopped. A mercy, he'd told himself, an act of love. The law, had it known, would have called it murder. A sudden crash from the back of the saloon jerked Jacob from his thoughts. Most patrons barely looked up. Brawls and disturbances were common enough, but something about the sound that followed made Jacob straighten. It wasn't the typical crash of breaking furniture or male voices raised in anger. It was a child's voice, high and frightened, coming from somewhere behind the saloon. "Please, no! I didn't mean to drop it." The pleading cut through the ambient noise like a knife, silencing the nearest conversations. Jacob set his glass down, suddenly alert, in a way he hadn't been in years. The bartender caught his eye and shook his head slightly. "Best mind your own business, stranger. Some things in this town ain't worth the trouble they bring." But Jacob was already moving toward the back door, pushed by an instinct he'd thought long dead. The whiskey forgotten, he shouldered his way through the crowd, ignoring the curious glances that followed him. The night air hit him like a physical force as he stepped into the narrow alley behind the saloon. The smell of garbage and urine was overwhelming, but it was the tableau before him that froze the breath in his lungs. A girl no more than 12 knelt in the dirt beside an overturned bucket, frantically trying to gather scattered potatoes. Her dress was little more than rags, her auburn hair hanging in tangled strands around a face too thin and too pale. But it was her eyes that struck Jacob, the hardest, large, dark, and filled with an acceptance that no child should ever possess. Standing over her was a man built like a bull's shoulders, straining against a dirty shirt face, flushed with alcohol and rage. In his hand, a lit cigarette glowed ominously in the darkness. "Clumsy little wretch," the man slurred. "Maybe a little fire will teach you to be more careful with what belongs to others." The girl looked up at him, and in a voice devoid of hope, but strangely steady, asked, "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me this time, or find a new way?" The casual way she said it, as if this was a routine they'd performed many times before, hit Jacob like a physical blow. In that moment, something inside him shifted. Not a breaking, but a reformation, like iron being forged into steel. "I don't think that's going to happen," Jacob said, stepping forward into the circle of light that spilled from the saloon's back window. The man spun around, swaying slightly. Up close, Jacob could see the network of broken blood vessels across his nose and cheeks, the mark of a long-term drinker. But there was something else, something in the man's bleary eyes that gave Jacob pause. A flash of recognition. "This ain't none of your concern, stranger," the man growled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I'm making it my concern," Jacob replied evenly, his hand resting near his belt, where a knife was concealed. "Step away from the girl." For a moment, the alley fell silent except for the distant sounds from the saloon and the girl's ragged breathing. The man's hand moved toward a knife at his belt, and Jacob felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the same detached calm that had served him through the bloodiest days of Antietam and Gettysburg. "You best walk away," the man said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "Can't do that," Jacob replied. "Why don't you go sleep off that whiskey? We can pretend this never happened." The man lunged forward, knife drawn, moving with the clumsy aggression of a drunk who had once known how to fight. Jacob sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him, and brought his knee up into the attacker's solar plexus. The air left the man's lungs in an explosive whoosh as he doubled over. Jacob quickly relieved him of the knife, sending it skittering into the darkness. "Stay down," Jacob advised, as the man writhed in the dirt, And if I hear you've laid another hand on her, I'll finish what we started here tonight." Only then did Jacob turn his full attention to the girl who was watching the entire scene with those two old eyes. He crouched down to her level, keeping his movements slow and his voice gentle. "Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head mutely, still clutching a potato in her small, dirt-stained hand. Up close, Jacob could see the hollow cheeks that spoke of chronic hunger, the faded bruises at her wrists, and most concerning, the slight flush of fever across her cheekbones. "What's your name?" he asked, settling back on his heels to appear less threatening. "Emma," she whispered, then glanced quickly at the man who was slowly struggling to his feet. "Emma Sullivan." "I'm Dr. Jacob Reynolds," he replied, offering a smile he hoped was reassuring. "And I think maybe you and I should have a talk somewhere safer than this alley." The man spat in the dirt. "She comes home with me," he snarled. "She's my responsibility." "Your responsibility." Jacob stood slowly, letting his full height, 6 feet and 2 inches of frontier-hardened muscle remind the man exactly who had won their brief encounter. "The way I see it, you forfeited any claim to responsibility when you decided to use a lit cigarette as a teaching tool." The man opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it when he saw Jacob's hand drift back toward his knife. Instead, he backed away, pointing a shaking finger at Emma. "You come home when you're ready to behave," he said, an empty threat from a beaten man. "And don't think this stranger's going to be around to protect you forever." With that, he stumbled away into the darkness, leaving Jacob and Emma alone in the alley, with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the distant piano music from the saloon. Jacob watched until he was certain the man was truly gone, then turned back to Emma, who was still crouched against the wall. "Emma," he said softly, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. Finally, she shrugged a gesture that tried to appear casual but couldn't hide the profound sadness behind it. "I eat," she said simply, but the way she said it told Jacob everything he needed to know about the quality and quantity of those meals. "Would you like to join me for dinner?" he asked. "There's a boarding house down the street that serves decent food, and I could use the company." For the first time since he'd met her, something resembling hope flickered in Emma's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by wariness, and she shook her head. "He'll be angry if I don't come home," she said, though they both knew that her guardian would be angry regardless of what she did. "Let me worry about him," Jacob said, extending his hand to help her up. "Tonight, you're going to eat a real meal and sleep in a real bed. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." She stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. Trust did not come easily to someone who had learned that the people supposed to protect her were often the source of her greatest pain. But hunger and exhaustion were powerful motivators, and finally, tentatively, she reached out and placed her small hand in his. The touch sent a shock through Jacob's system, not romantic, but something deeper and more primal. It was the touch of someone reaching out for salvation, and he knew in that moment that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Martha Wilson's boarding house sat at the quieter end of Copper Creek's main street, its white-painted facade and neat curtains a stark contrast to the saloons and gambling halls that dominated the town center. The smell of fresh bread and beef stew greeted them as Jacob led Emma up the porch steps. Mrs. Wilson herself answered the door, a stout woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her stern expression softened immediately when she saw Emma. "Land's sakes," she murmured, ushering them inside. "Dr. Reynolds, I see you've brought a guest." Jacob had been staying at the boarding house for the past 3 days, and while he hadn't shared much about his past with Mrs. Wilson, she had quickly intuited that he was a physician, perhaps from the medical texts he carried. or the way he had tended to another boarder's injured hand, without a second thought. "This is Emma," Jacob said simply. "She could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest tonight." Mrs. Wilson needed no further explanation. She led them to the dining room, where a few other boarders were finishing their evening meal, and quickly set about preparing a plate of stew and fresh bread for Emma. "Eat slowly now," Mrs. Wilson advised, as she placed the steaming bowl before the girl. "When the stomach's not used to proper food, it can rebel if you rush." Emma nodded, but her eyes never left the food. She picked up the spoon with trembling fingers and began to eat with the focused intensity of someone who had known real hunger. Jacob watched her, his physician's mind cataloging symptoms, the slight wheeze in her breathing, the periodic dry cough she tried to suppress, the feverish sheen to her skin. "She's Robert Sullivan's ward, isn't she?" Mrs. Wilson asked quietly, pulling Jacob aside while Emma ate. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "The man from the alley. He said he was responsible for her." Mrs. Wilson's lips tightened into a thin line. "That's what he claims, but it's not the whole truth. Robert Sullivan isn't her father nor her stepfather. He took her in after her mother died, supposedly out of the goodness of his heart." The way she said it made it clear she believed no such thing. "What happened to her mother?" Jacob asked. "Margaret Sullivan, though she wasn't actually married to Robert, died about 6 months ago. The official story is that she fell down the stairs, but—" Mrs. Wilson trailed off, glancing toward Emma. "Well, let's just say accidents seem to happen frequently around Robert Sullivan, especially when he's been drinking." Jacob felt a cold anger building inside him. "And no one has done anything about it. The sheriff." Mrs. Wilson gave a humorless laugh. "Sheriff Morrison owes Sullivan money from poker games. Besides, who's going to take the word of a child over a grown man in this town?" The truth of her words was like a knife to the heart. In towns like Copper Creek, justice was often a commodity to be bought and sold, and children had no currency with which to purchase it. "She can stay here tonight," Mrs. Wilson continued. "I have a small room at the back that's rarely used, but Sullivan will come looking for her eventually. He gets a monthly stipend from the mining company compensation for families of miners who died in accidents. Margaret's first husband was killed in a cave-in 3 years ago, and Sullivan uses the money meant for Emma to fund his drinking." Jacob watched as Emma carefully sopped up the last of her stew with a piece of bread, eating as if each bite might be her last. Something protective and fierce stirred within him, a feeling he thought had died with Sarah. "I'll deal with Sullivan when the time comes," he said. "For now, let's just make sure she gets some rest." After Emma had eaten and Mrs. Wilson had shown her to a small, clean room at the back of the house, Jacob took the opportunity to examine her more thoroughly. His suspicions were confirmed within minutes. "How long have you had that cough, Emma?" he asked gently, listening to her lungs with his stethoscope, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his former life. Emma shrugged. "A while. It's worse at night." Jacob nodded, keeping his expression neutral, even as his mind registered the telltale sounds in her chest, the slight crackling that suggested fluid in the lungs, the labored quality of her breathing. "Do you cough up anything?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes it has blood in it," she admitted quietly. "Mr. Sullivan says it's because I'm bad inside." Jacob had to take a moment to control the surge of rage that threatened to overwhelm him. "That's not true, Emma. You're not bad inside or out. You're sick, but it's not your fault." "I know," she said, surprising him with her certainty. "Mama was a nurse. She taught me about sickness before she died. She said consumption isn't a punishment, It's just bad luck." Jacob stared at her, momentarily taken aback. "Your mother was a nurse." Emma nodded, a flicker of pride crossing her face. "During the war, she worked in the field hospitals. She taught me lots of things about medicine. She said knowledge is something no one can take from you." Jacob felt a strange prickling at the back of his neck. "What was your mother's full name?" "Rebecca Margaret Lawson," Emma replied. "But she used Sullivan after she started living with Mr. Sullivan. She wasn't really his wife, though. She told me that." Jacob frowned, trying to recall if he'd known a nurse by that name during his time as a field surgeon. He'd worked with dozens of nurses throughout the war, but the name didn't immediately trigger any specific memory. "Did your mother ever mention where she served, which battles or hospitals?" Emma's brow furrowed in concentration. "She talked about a place called Antietam a lot, and Gettysburg. She said those were the worst days." The prickling sensation intensified. Jacob had served at both battles, had performed countless surgeries in the blood-soaked field hospitals while the fighting raged nearby. Could he have known Rebecca? The war had been chaotic, with medical personnel often reassigned as needed. It was entirely possible their paths had crossed. She had a picture, Emma continued, reaching into a hidden pocket in her tattered dress, of her with some of the doctors. She withdrew a small creased photograph and handed it to Jacob. The image was faded and worn at the edges, but still clear enough to make out a group of exhausted-looking medical personnel standing outside a tent hospital. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as he recognized himself, younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably him standing at the edge of the group. And there, in the center, was a young woman with Emma's same dark eyes. "This is you, isn't it?" Emma asked, pointing to Jacob's image in the photograph. "Mama didn't say your name, but she said there was a doctor who was kind when others weren't. She said he helped soldiers who couldn't be saved die without pain." Jacob nearly dropped the photograph, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. How could this child know about that? About the mercy killings he'd performed when wounds were mortal and suffering was immense. It was his darkest secret, the reason he'd eventually been dismissed from the army, though officially he'd resigned for personal reasons. "Your mother told you about that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded solemnly. "She said sometimes the kindest thing a doctor can do is stop the pain, even if it means the person has to go to heaven sooner. She said most people didn't understand that." Jacob's mind raced. If Rebecca had known about his actions, had possibly even assisted with them, it created a connection he couldn't ignore. Was this meeting with Emma truly coincidence, or something more? "Emma, did your mother ever mention me by name? Did she know I was here in Copper Creek?" Emma shook her head. "She died 6 months ago. But she used to say that someday she hoped I'd meet the doctor who understood mercy. She said he'd recognize me even if I didn't recognize him." A chill ran down Jacob's spine. It was as if Rebecca had somehow known their paths would cross. Or perhaps it was merely the feverish ramblings of a dying woman that Emma had interpreted as prophecy. "You should rest now," Jacob said, tucking the blanket around her thin shoulders. "We'll talk more in the morning." Emma's eyes were already drooping with exhaustion, but she reached out and grasped his hand. "You won't leave, will you? Mr. Sullivan might come." "I'll be right outside the door," Jacob promised. "No one's going to hurt you tonight." As Emma drifted into sleep, Jacob settled into a chair outside her room, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He studied Rebecca's face, trying to pull forth memories from the chaos of the war. There had been so many nurses, so many wounded, so much blood and screaming and death. Faces blurred together in his mind, obscured by the fog of time and trauma. But there had been a nurse, he remembered now, who had never flinched when he administered the fatal doses of morphine to the mortally wounded, who had sometimes even prepared the syringes for him when the suffering became too much to bear. Could that have been Rebecca? And what of Sullivan? There was something vaguely familiar about him, too. Something that Jacob couldn't quite place. Had they also crossed paths during the war? Outside, the night deepened as Copper Creek slowly quieted. Jacob's thoughts turned to Sarah, to the night he had increased her morphine dose for the last time. He had told himself it was an act of mercy, of love, sparing her the final, most agonizing stages of consumption. But he had never quite been able to forgive himself for playing God in that moment. Now fate had placed another consumption victim in his path, a child who somehow seemed connected to his past in ways he was only beginning to understand. Was this a chance at redemption, or merely another tragedy he was powerless to prevent? As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jacob made a decision. He would not abandon Emma to Sullivan's cruelty or to the indifference of Copper Creek. Whatever their connection might be, whatever Rebecca might have known or intended, Jacob owed it to both mother and daughter to ensure Emma's remaining time was spent in safety and comfort. Little did he know that this decision would set in motion events that would force him to confront not only his past, but the very nature of forgiveness and redemption. The morning brought with it a fresh wave of coughing from Emma's room. Jacob, who had dozed fitfully in the chair outside her door, was instantly alert at the sound. He entered to find her doubled over a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, as her small frame shook with the effort of clearing her lungs. When the spasm passed, Jacob gently took the handkerchief from her hand. The bright spots of blood confirmed what he already knew: the disease was advancing. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't be sorry," Jacob replied, pouring her a glass of water from the pitcher on the nightstand. "It's not your fault." She accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips, as Jacob had taught her. "Is it the same thing your wife had?" she asked after a moment. Jacob stared at her in surprise. He hadn't mentioned Sarah to Emma. "How did you know about my wife?" Emma lowered the glass, looking suddenly uncertain. "You said her name in your sleep." "Sarah. You kept saying you were sorry." Jacob felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with a deeper discomfort. Had he been talking in his sleep, it was possible the nightmares came frequently enough. "Yes," he admitted after a pause. "My wife Sarah died of consumption 3 years ago." Emma's dark eyes studied him with that unnerving adult quality. "Did you help her, like you helped the soldiers?" The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deny it, to offer some sanitized version of the truth, but found he couldn't lie to those knowing eyes. "Yes," he said finally. "She was in so much pain at the end, I couldn't bear to watch her suffer anymore." He expected judgment, perhaps even fear, but Emma merely nodded. "Mama said that's what love sometimes looks like. Doing the hard thing because it's the right thing." Jacob felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. How was it possible that this child, this stranger, seemed to understand and accept what he had done, when he himself had been unable to for years? "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was," Emma agreed. "She told me that if I ever met you, I should trust you. She said you carried more pain than most, because you took on the pain of others." Jacob couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Had Rebecca really said those things? Or was Emma constructing a narrative to make sense of their meeting? A knock at the boarding house door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Wilson's voice floated down the hallway, followed by heavier footsteps. Jacob tensed his hand automatically, reaching for the knife at his belt. "It's Sullivan," Mrs. Wilson said from the doorway, her face tight with concern. He's demanding to see Emma. Jacob rose to his full height. Tell him she's not well enough for visitors. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. He's not taking no for an answer. Says if she doesn't come with him now, he'll bring the sheriff back with him. Emma clutched at the blanket, her knuckles white with fear. I should go, she whispered. He'll only get worse if I don't. You're not going anywhere with that man, Jacob said firmly. I'll deal with him. He strode down the hallway to the front parlor where Robert Sullivan stood, swaying slightly despite the early hour. The smell of whiskey hung around him like a cloud. Where is she? Sullivan demanded, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he spotted Jacob. You got no right to keep her from me. She's ill, Jacob replied coldly. She needs rest and proper care, not abuse. Sullivan's face flushed with anger. Who the hell do you think you are? She's my ward. I got papers that say so. Do you? Jacob challenged. Because Mrs. Wilson tells me you're not related to Emma at all. That you took her in after her mother died conveniently in an accident while under your care. Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, a mixture of rage and something else. Fear, perhaps. Guilt. You don't know nothing about it, he spat. Rebecca was mine. The girl is mine. And I'll be damned if some drifter is going to tell me different. Jacob took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Sullivan could hear. I know exactly what kind of man you are, Sullivan. I saw the cigarette burns on Emma's arms. I heard her ask if you were going to burn her again, as if it were a regular occurrence. As a physician, I could report you for child abuse. Sullivan sneered. To who, Sheriff Morrison, go ahead. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. Maybe not to the sheriff, Jacob conceded, but the mining company might be interested to know how their compensation money is being spent. Or perhaps the territorial governor would like to hear about a town where children can be abused with impunity. The threat hit home. Sullivan's swagger faltered, his face paling beneath the flush of alcohol. The mining company had significant influence in territorial politics, and while local law might look the other way, higher authorities were another matter entirely. You're bluffing, Sullivan said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Try me, Jacob replied evenly. Or you can walk away now. Leave Emma with me. I'll see that she gets proper care. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. Care for what? She's dying, same as her mother. Consumption's got her. She won't last the year. The casual cruelty of the statement made Jacob's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. All the more reason she should spend her remaining time in peace, not terror. For a moment, Sullivan seemed to waver. Something passed across his face, a ghost of an emotion that Jacob couldn't quite identify. Then the moment was gone, replaced by cold calculation. Fine, he said finally. Keep her, but the stipend comes to me. It's legally mine. Jacob felt disgust rise in his throat. Is that all you care about? The money. Sullivan's laugh was bitter. What else is there to care about in this God-forsaken world? She's dying. You're dying. We're all dying, Doctor. Some just faster than others. With that, he turned and stumbled out of the boarding house, leaving Jacob standing in the parlor with his hands clenched into fists and his mind racing. Mrs. Wilson appeared at his side, her expression grim. He'll be back, she said quietly, when he's sobered up enough to realize what he's losing. The stipend is substantial, $50 a month. In Copper Creek, that's a fortune. Jacob nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we'll need to be prepared. I'm going to need to speak with someone at the mining company, establish legal guardianship if possible. Mrs. Wilson raised an eyebrow. Are you planning to stay in Copper Creek? Then I thought you were just passing through. It was a fair question. Jacob had spent 5 years drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to form attachments or be remembered. The thought of putting down roots even temporarily sent a spike of anxiety through him. But then he thought of Emma, of the trust in her eyes when she'd placed her hand in his, of Rebecca, who had somehow known they would meet, of Sarah, whose death had set him on this lonely path. "I'm staying," he said finally, "at least until I can ensure Emma's safety." Mrs. Wilson studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if satisfied. "There's a doctor in town, William Montgomery. He might be able to help with the legal matters. He has some influence with the mining company." Jacob felt a flicker of recognition at the name. "Montgomery. William Montgomery. Yes? Do you know him?" Jacob's mind raced back to the war, to a field hospital near Gettysburg where he had worked alongside another surgeon, a competent, quiet man who had never questioned Jacob's methods with the mortally wounded. "I might," he said slowly. "We may have served together during the war." Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened slightly. "Well then, perhaps you'll find more connections in Copper Creek than you expected." As Jacob returned to Emma's room to share the news that Sullivan had temporarily backed down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something larger than himself, a web of connections and coincidences that seemed too deliberate to be mere chance. Emma was sitting up in bed, her thin face anxious, until she saw Jacob's expression. "He's gone, for now," Jacob confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "And I've decided to stay in Copper Creek for a while, to make sure you're safe and getting proper care." The hope that bloomed on Emma's face was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Really, you're not leaving? Not anytime soon," Jacob promised. "But I need to ask you something, Emma. Something important." She nodded solemnly. "Your mother, Rebecca. You said she knew me during the war, that she told you about me. I need to know exactly what she said, and why she thought we might meet someday." Emma's gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting the blanket nervously. She said you were a good man who did hard things, that you helped people who were suffering when no one else would. She said if I ever met you, I should tell you that she understood why you did what you did, and that she kept your secret. Jacob felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "What secret, Emma?" "About the soldiers," she whispered. "The ones who couldn't be saved. She said you gave them peace when others would have let them suffer. She said it wasn't murder, it was mercy." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Rebecca had known, had perhaps even helped him, and had kept that knowledge all these years, even sharing it with her daughter. Did she say anything else about why she thought we might meet? Emma hesitated, then reached beneath her pillow and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "She wrote this before she died. She said, if I ever met you, I should give it to you." With trembling hands, Jacob unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. The script of someone writing through pain. Dr. Reynolds. "If you are reading this, then my Emma has found you as I prayed she would. I cannot explain how I know your paths would cross, call it a dying woman's intuition, or divine providence. But I knew Emma would need someone like you in her life after I was gone. You may not remember me from Antietam or Gettysburg. I was one of many nurses who assisted you, but I remember you. I remember your compassion when faced with the impossible. I remember how you took on the burden of ending suffering when it could not be cured. Emma is dying just as I am. The consumption works quickly in our family. She will need someone who understands that quality of life matters more than quantity. Someone who knows when to fight and when to surrender with grace. Robert Sullivan is not the man I thought he was when I joined my life with his. The war changed him as it changed us all. What was once courage became cruelty. What was once strength became brutality. I fear for Emma when I am gone. There is more to tell, but not in this letter. Emma carries my journal. In it, you will find the full truth about Sullivan, about me, and about the promise I made that binds us together. Please, help her find the Valley of Souls. It is a real place, though I know it sounds like a dying woman's fantasy. It lies west in the mountains, near the California border, a valley of wildflowers where wounded spirits can find peace. I promised Emma I would meet her there, if not in body, then in spirit. With gratitude and hope, Rebecca Lawson. Sullivan Jacob reread the letter twice, his mind struggling to process its contents. The Valley of Souls, a promise beyond death. It sounded like the feverish imagination of a woman in the final stages of consumption. And yet, "Your mother mentioned a journal," he said finally. "Do you have it?" Emma nodded, reaching again into the hidden pocket of her dress and withdrawing a small leather-bound book. "Mr. Sullivan doesn't know about it. Mama hid it before she died and told me where to find it. She said it was important that he never read it." Jacob accepted the journal but didn't open it immediately. This was something to be read in private, when he could fully absorb whatever secrets it contained. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said, carefully tucking the journal and letter into his coat pocket. "Your mother was right about one thing. I'm going to do everything I can to help you, Emma. I promise." Emma's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, brief but brilliant. "I know," she said simply. "Mama said you would." As Jacob left Emma to rest, his mind was reeling with questions. Who had Rebecca Lawson Sullivan really been to him? What secrets did her journal hold? And what was this Valley of Souls she spoke of with such certainty? He would find the answers, he resolved. For Emma's sake, for Rebecca's memory, and perhaps, finally, for his own peace of mind. Dr. William Montgomery's office was located on the ground floor of one of the few brick buildings in Copper Creek, its neat white sign a stark contrast to the saloon next door. Jacob hesitated on the sidewalk, marshaling his thoughts before entering. If Montgomery was indeed the same surgeon he had known during the war, their reunion could be either a blessing or a complication. The bell above the door jingled as Jacob stepped inside. The waiting room was empty, except for a young woman at a desk, presumably Montgomery's nurse or assistant. "May I help you?" she asked, looking up from her paperwork. "I'd like to see Dr. Montgomery if he's available," Jacob replied. "It's regarding a professional matter." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Your name, sir?" "Dr. Jacob Reynolds." A flash of recognition crossed her face. "Oh, Dr. Montgomery mentioned you might be coming by. He said to show you in immediately if you came." Jacob raised an eyebrow, surprised. "He's expecting me. Mrs. Wilson sent word this morning," she explained, rising from her desk. "Please follow me." She led Jacob through a door into a well-appointed examination room where a man in his 40s was washing his hands at a basin. He turned as they entered, and Jacob immediately recognized the lean face and thoughtful eyes of William Montgomery. The years had added gray to Montgomery's once dark hair and lines around his eyes, but his bearing was still that of the meticulous surgeon Jacob had known. "Reynolds," Montgomery said, drying his hands on a towel, "I thought it might be you when Mrs. Wilson described the new doctor in town. Not many physicians drift through places like Copper Creek." "Montgomery," Jacob acknowledged with a nod. "It's been a long time." 17 years, give or take," Montgomery agreed. "Not since Gettysburg, if memory serves." The nurse excused herself, closing the door behind her. As soon as they were alone, Montgomery's professional demeanor softened slightly. I heard you were dismissed from the army, he said quietly, for your methods with the mortally wounded. Jacob tensed his hand instinctively, moving toward the knife at his belt. Is that common knowledge in Copper Creek? Montgomery shook his head. No, no, I've never spoken of it to anyone. But I was there, Reynolds. I saw what you did. I understood it, even if our superiors didn't. Jacob studied the other doctor's face, looking for signs of judgment or condemnation, but found only a weary acceptance. You never reported me, Jacob said. It wasn't a question. No, Montgomery confirmed. What would have been the point? You were showing mercy to men who would have died in agony otherwise. I might not have had the courage to do it myself, but I couldn't condemn you for it. Some of the tension left Jacob's shoulders. If Montgomery had kept his secret all these years, perhaps he could be trusted now. I'm here about Emma Sullivan, Jacob said, getting to the point. Mrs. Wilson said you might be able to help with the legal aspects of her situation. Montgomery's expression darkened. Ah, yes, the Sullivan girl. I've been concerned about her for some time. You've examined her. I tried to, Montgomery said grimly. Several months ago, when the cough first appeared. But Sullivan refused to pay for treatment, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't pursue the matter further. He sighed heavily. The mining company provides basic medical coverage for its workers and their families, but Sullivan argued that since he's only Emma's guardian, not her stepfather, she doesn't qualify. It was a lie, of course. The company's policy covers orphans of deceased miners, which Emma certainly is, but Sullivan pockets that money for himself. Jacob felt his anger rising again. And no one has challenged him on this. Montgomery spread his hands helplessly. Sullivan has connections in this town not just with Sheriff Morrison, but with several influential mine supervisors. He was something of a hero during the war, from what I understand. Saved a lot of lives at Antietam. That buys a man considerable leeway, even years later. Jacob frowned. Sullivan was at Antietam. So I've heard, Montgomery replied, though I never encountered him personally. Different unit, I suppose. Jacob's mind raced back to that bloody September day in 1862. Had Sullivan been there? The man had seemed vaguely familiar when they confronted each other in the alley, but Jacob had attributed that to the common features of a certain type of frontier bully. What unit? Jacob asked. Montgomery shrugged. I couldn't say for certain. You'd have to ask him, though I wouldn't recommend it. Sullivan's not the man he once was, if the stories are true. The war changed him, or perhaps revealed what was always there beneath the surface. Jacob thought of the cruel eyes and alcohol-ravaged face of the man who had been about to burn a child with a cigarette. It was hard to imagine him as any kind of hero. About Emma, Jacob said, returning to his primary concern, I need to establish some form of legal guardianship. Sullivan has backed off for now, but he'll be back. And Emma needs medical care that he's been denying her. Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. The simplest approach would be to get Sullivan to sign over guardianship voluntarily. Given his interest in the stipend, he might be persuaded if he could keep receiving the money without the responsibility of the child. And if he refuses, then we'd need to prove him unfit, which would require witnesses to his abuse and neglect. Mrs. Wilson might testify, but we'd need others. And we'd need to convince Judge Hollister, who's not known for his progressive views on parental rights. Jacob considered this. What about the mining company? Could they intervene if they knew Sullivan was misappropriating the stipend? Possibly, Montgomery allowed. Mr. Harrison, the company superintendent, is a reasonable man. If he knew the full situation, he might be persuaded to redirect the payments, or at least investigate Sullivan's guardianship claims. Jacob nodded, feeling a plan beginning to form. "I'll speak with Harrison then, and in the meantime I'd like you to examine Emma properly this time. Document her condition and any signs of abuse." Montgomery hesitated. "You know as well as I do what consumption looks like in its advanced stages, Reynolds. If she's already coughing blood—" "I know," Jacob said quietly, "but she deserves whatever comfort we can provide, however long she has left." Montgomery studied him for a long moment. "You seem particularly invested in this child's welfare for someone who was just passing through." Jacob thought about Rebecca's letter, about the strange connection that seemed to exist between him and Emma, even before they'd met. Should he share his suspicions with Montgomery? The other doctor had kept his secret about the Mercy killings, but this was different, more personal. "I knew her mother," Jacob said finally, a partial truth. "During the war. She was a nurse at Antietam and Gettysburg." Montgomery's eyebrows rose. "Rebecca Lawson, you knew her. You did too." "Not well," Montgomery admitted. "She assisted in my operating tent once or twice. Competent woman, steady hands. I was surprised to hear she'd taken up with someone like Sullivan after the war." Jacob's curiosity deepened. "Do you know how they met?" Montgomery frowned thoughtfully. "I believe they knew each other before the war, actually. Sullivan was from the same town in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, I think. There was some story about him rescuing her from a fire as a child. They reconnected after Antietam, from what I understand." This new piece of information settled uncomfortably in Jacob's mind. If Sullivan and Rebecca had a history that predated the war, it added another layer of complexity to the situation. What had turned a childhood hero into an abuser? And why had Rebecca, by all accounts, an intelligent and compassionate woman, chosen to stay with such a man? "There's more to this story than meets the eye," Jacob murmured almost to himself. "There usually is," Montgomery agreed, "especially where the war is concerned. It changed us all, didn't it? Some for better, some for worse." Jacob couldn't argue with that. The war had taken his youth, his idealism, and eventually, in a roundabout way, his wife. It had turned him into a drifter, a man running from his past. What had it done to Sullivan, to Rebecca? "I should get back to Emma," Jacob said, rising from his chair. "Will you come by Mrs. Wilson's later to examine her?" Montgomery nodded. "Around 4, if that suits. And Reynolds—" He hesitated, then continued, "Whatever you decide to do about Sullivan, be careful. There's more going on in this town than is immediately apparent. The mining company has its fingers in everything, and not always for the better." "I'll keep that in mind," Jacob promised, though his thoughts were already racing ahead to his next steps. He needed to read Rebecca's journal to understand what she had meant about the full truth and this mysterious Valley of Souls. As he stepped back onto the dusty main street of Copper Creek, Jacob felt the weight of the journal in his pocket, like a physical presence. Whatever secrets it contained, he sensed they would change the course of his life and Emma's irrevocably. The sun was high overhead, casting harsh shadows across the town's weathered buildings. In the distance, the mountains rose against the sky, their peaks still snow-capped despite the summer heat. Somewhere beyond those mountains, if Rebecca was to be believed, lay a valley where wounded souls could find peace. Jacob didn't know if such a place truly existed, but he was beginning to believe that his journey there had already begun the moment he stepped into that alley behind the Golden Nugget Saloon. The leather-bound journal lay open on Jacob's lap, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of an oil lamp. Night had fallen over Copper Creek, and the boarding house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Emma slept peacefully in the next room, her breathing labored but steady after Montgomery's examination that afternoon. Jacob turned another page, his physician's eyes narrowing as he tried to decipher Rebecca's increasingly unsteady handwriting. The journal entries began 2 years after the war and chronicled her life with Sullivan and Emma. The early pages depicted a relationship built on shared trauma and mutual need. Sullivan broken by the war, Rebecca desperate to rebuild some semblance of family after losing her first husband in the mines. But as Jacob read further, a darker picture emerged. Sullivan's drinking had worsened over time, his moods becoming unpredictable, then violent. Rebecca described hiding bruises, making excuses, planning escapes only to be drawn back by Sullivan's tearful promises to change. One entry in particular made Jacob's blood run cold. April 17, 1885. Robert found the letter I had written to the mining company about Emma's stipend. The rage in his eyes, I've never seen anything like it. He said I was betraying him after all he'd done for us, as if taking in a dying miner's widow and child was some great charity rather than a calculated move to secure the monthly payments. When I reminded him that the money was meant for Emma's care, he struck me so hard I saw stars. Then he burned the letter before my eyes and said if I ever tried to contact the company again, he would make sure Emma suffered for it. I cannot leave, not yet. Emma needs the medicine I've been secretly buying with the laundry money and we have nowhere else to go. But I've begun hiding small amounts whenever I can. One day we will escape to the valley. My grandmother spoke of the place where wildflowers bloom year-round and wounded souls find peace. Jacob closed his eyes, imagining Rebecca's desperation. He'd seen similar situations during his years of practice, women trapped in abusive relationships by financial dependence, fear, or misplaced loyalty. But there was something particularly heartbreaking about Rebecca's situation, especially knowing how it had ended. He turned to the final entries written in a hand that trembled with either fear or illness, perhaps both October 3rd, 1886. The cough is worse today. I've been hiding the blood from Emma, but she's too observant not to have noticed. She asked me this morning if I was going to heaven like her father. How does one answer such a question? I told her about the Valley of Souls. Instead, the place between worlds where those who leave can still watch over those who remain. I described the wildflowers, the clear streams, the perfect peace. She listened with such hope in her eyes that for a moment I almost believed it myself. But hope is a luxury I can ill afford. I must be practical. I've sewn the last of our savings into the lining of Emma's dress and hidden this journal where Robert won't find it. If something happens to me, she will at least have the means to escape. I've also written to Dr. Reynolds, or rather, written a letter he may never receive. It seems foolish, perhaps, the beginning of consumption fever, but I cannot shake the feeling that he will find Emma when I am gone. He, of all people, will understand what must be done when her time comes. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Rebecca's death, October 29th, 1886. Robert knows. God help us, he knows everything. I was delirious with fever last night and spoke of things I should never have mentioned about Antietam, about Dr. Reynolds, and the mercy he showed the dying, about how I helped him prepare the morphine when the wounds were beyond hope. The look on Robert's face was terrible to behold. He called me a murderer, an accomplice to evil. He didn't understand, couldn't understand, that what we did was an act of compassion, not cruelty. He knows about the money now, too. He tore apart Emma's dress while she slept and found the coins I had hidden. When I tried to stop him, he pushed me against the wall and said that after I was gone, he would make sure Emma learned the price of deception. I am afraid not for myself, as I know my time is short, regardless, but for my daughter. I've told her where to find this journal after I'm gone, made her memorize the location of the valley from my grandmother's stories. West, always west, following the old Spanish trail into the mountains, where the three peaks meet like fingers reaching for heaven. If you are reading this, Dr. Reynolds, I beg you take Emma away from here. Find the valley. Let her last days be filled with beauty instead of fear. And when the time comes, show her the same mercy you showed those soldiers, the same mercy I wish someone had shown me. Jacob closed the journal, his mind reeling. Rebecca's words confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that her death had been no accident, and that Sullivan's cruelty toward Emma stemmed not just from general brutality, but from a specific vendetta. Sullivan saw the girl as the daughter of a murderer, a living reminder of what he perceived as Rebecca's betrayal. But something else troubled Jacob even more deeply. Rebecca's certainty that he would find Emma, that he would be the one to guide her through her final days, struck him as impossibly prescient. How could she have known their paths would cross? What force had drawn him to Copper Creek at precisely the moment Emma needed him most? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Jacob quickly tucked the journal into his coat pocket as Mrs. Wilson entered, carrying a tray with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting the tray on a small table. "You've been reading for hours." Jacob rubbed his eyes, suddenly aware of the stiffness in his shoulders and the late hour. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. How is Emma?" "Sleeping, finally." Mrs. Wilson poured coffee for both of them and settled into a chair across from Jacob. "Dr. Montgomery's medicine seems to have eased her breathing, at least for now." Jacob nodded, accepting the steaming cup. Montgomery had confirmed what he already knew. Emma's consumption was advanced with perhaps 6 months of life remaining, and that was an optimistic estimate. "Did Montgomery say anything else after I left?" Jacob asked. Mrs. Wilson hesitated, turning her cup in her hands. "He mentioned that Sheriff Morrison was asking questions about you. Apparently, Sullivan went to him this afternoon claiming you'd kidnapped his ward." Jacob snorted. "That's hardly surprising." "No, but it's concerning. Morrison may be corrupt, but he's still the law in Copper Creek. If Sullivan pushes hard enough—" She let the sentence hang unfinished. "I'll deal with Morrison if necessary," Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. "Tomorrow I'll speak with the mining company superintendent about redirecting Emma's stipend." Mrs. Wilson studied him over the rim of her cup. "You've become quite invested in this child in a very short time, Dr. Reynolds. May I ask why?" Jacob considered how much to share. Mrs. Wilson had proven herself a trustworthy ally, but Rebecca's journal contained secrets that weren't entirely his to reveal. "I knew her mother," he said finally. "During the war, we worked together in field hospitals." "I see." Mrs. Wilson's tone suggested she sensed there was more to the story but wouldn't press further. "And what are your plans for Emma Sullivan will not give up easily, especially if money is involved?" Jacob stared into the dark depths of his coffee, thinking of Rebecca's final request. "There's a place, a valley in the mountains near the California border. Rebecca wanted Emma to go there." Mrs. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "You mean to take her all that way, in her condition? If necessary, yes. She deserves to spend her remaining time somewhere beautiful, somewhere safe." Jacob set down his cup, meeting Mrs. Wilson's skeptical gaze. "I know it sounds foolish, perhaps even cruel, to move a dying child so far, but I made a promise, or rather Rebecca believed I would make such a promise, and I intend to honor it." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. "It's not foolish to want to grant a dying wish, Dr. Reynolds, but Copper Creek is not a town that easily releases what it considers its own. Sullivan has friends here, as does the mining company. If you plan to leave with Emma, you'll need to do so carefully." "I understand," Jacob said. and I appreciate your help more than I can say." Mrs. Wilson rose, gathering the empty cups. "Get some rest, Doctor. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." After she left, Jacob extinguished the lamp and stretched out on the narrow bed, fully clothed. Sleep was slow in coming, his mind too full of Rebecca's words and the strange path that had led him to Emma. Outside Copper Creek settled into the quiet rhythms of a frontier town. At night, the occasional burst of laughter from the saloons, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whisper of wind through the gaps in the boarding house's wooden walls. Tomorrow would indeed bring challenges, but for the first time in years, Jacob felt something stirring within him that he had thought long dead purpose. Tug. The offices of the Copper Creek Mining Company occupied the largest building in town, a two-story brick structure with a stone facade that stood in stark contrast to the wooden storefronts surrounding it. Jacob approached it the next morning with determined strides, Rebecca's journal secure in his coat pocket, as evidence if needed. The clerk at the front desk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger as Jacob entered. "May I help you, sir?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Harrison regarding a matter concerning a miner's orphan," Jacob replied. "Dr. Montgomery suggested he might be able to assist." The mention of Montgomery's name worked its intended effect. The clerk nodded and disappeared through a door behind the desk, returning moments later. "Mr. Harrison will see you now, sir. Last door on the right." Edward Harrison proved to be a surprise. Not the gruff, weathered mine boss Jacob had expected, but a well-dressed man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a carefully trimmed beard. He rose from behind a large oak desk as Jacob entered, extending his hand. "Dr. Reynolds, I presume William mentioned you might call. Please have a seat." Jacob shook the offered hand and settled into a leather chair facing the desk. The office was well appointed, but not ostentatious, practical luxury, befitting a man who valued efficiency over display. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Harrison. I'll come straight to the point. I'm here about Emma Sullivan, a daughter of Thomas Lawson, one of your miners who died in a cave-in 3 years ago." Harrison nodded, his expression turning somber. "Yes, the Lawson girl. A tragic situation. Her mother passed recently as well, I understand." "That's correct," Jacob confirmed. "And therein lies the problem. Robert Sullivan, who has been acting as Emma's guardian, is misusing the stipend meant for her care. Worse, he has been physically abusive toward her." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation, Doctor. Do you have evidence to support it?" "I do," Jacob said, withdrawing Rebecca's journal from his pocket. "This is Rebecca Lawson's journal, which documents Sullivan's abuse and his misappropriation of the stipend funds. Additionally, Dr. Montgomery has examined Emma and found evidence of malnutrition and physical trauma consistent with abuse." Harrison accepted the journal, but didn't immediately open it. "And your interest in this matter, Dr. Reynolds? Are you a relative of the child?" "No," Jacob admitted. "I knew her mother during the war. We served together in field hospitals at Antietam and Gettysburg. I encountered Emma by chance when Sullivan was about to burn her with a cigarette. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Harrison studied Jacob for a long moment, then carefully opened the journal, scanning several pages with a deepening frown. When he looked up, his eyes had hardened. "This is disturbing, to say the least. The company takes its responsibility toward miners' families very seriously, Dr. Reynolds. If what this journal describes is accurate, immediate action is required." "That's all I'm asking," Jacob said. "Emma is ill consumption advanced stage. She likely has only months to live. I want to ensure those months are spent in comfort, not fear." Harrison closed the journal and handed it back to Jacob. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Legal guardianship transferred to me with the stipend redirected accordingly. I intend to take Emma west to a place her mother spoke of, a valley with a climate that might ease her symptoms, if not prolong her life. And if Sullivan objects, he's already demonstrated he's an unfit guardian, Jacob pointed out. Between Rebecca's journal, Dr. Tur, Montgomery's medical assessment, and my own testimony, I believe we have sufficient grounds to override his objections. Harrison drummed his fingers on the desk, considering. Sullivan does have friends in town, including Sheriff Morrison. This could become complicated. I'm prepared for complications, Jacob said firmly. Emma's welfare is what matters now. After another moment of deliberation, Harrison nodded. Very well. I'll have our company lawyer draw up the necessary papers to transfer guardianship. It will require a judge's approval, of course, but Judge Hollister respects the company's recommendations in these matters. As for the stipend, I can redirect it immediately upon receiving the signed documents. Relief washed over Jacob. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate your swift response. Don't thank me yet, Doctor, Harrison cautioned, rising from his chair. Sullivan won't surrender without a fight, especially where money is concerned. And there's the matter of Emma's condition. Are you certain traveling is in her best interest? Jacob thought of Rebecca's final plea of Emma's dream to see the valley her mother had described. I believe honoring her mother's wishes and removing her from the source of her trauma outweighs the risks of travel. I'll ensure she has proper medical care throughout the journey. Harrison nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. As you say, the papers should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. Until then, I suggest you keep a close eye on Emma. Sullivan is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. Jacob left the mining company office with mixed feelings: relief that official support was forthcoming, but unease about Harrison's warning. Sullivan had backed down temporarily, but a man like that, when cornered, could be dangerous. As he walked back toward the boarding house, Jacob's attention was drawn to a figure standing in the shadow of the general store across the street, a tall, lean man in a dark coat who seemed to be watching him with unusual interest. When Jacob paused to get a better look, the man turned and disappeared down a side alley. Instinct prickled at the back of Jacob's neck. He quickened his pace, suddenly anxious to return to Emma. Something about the stranger's watchful presence felt ominous, a new complication in an already complex situation. Mrs. Wilson met him at the door, her normally composed features tight with concern. Dr. Reynolds, thank goodness you're back. We have a visitor, a Mr. Pinkerton, from the Territorial Marshal's office. He's asking about you. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. Pinkerton, the name carried implications that sent a chill through him. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was well known for tracking down fugitives, and while Jacob wasn't technically a fugitive, his past actions during the war existed in a moral and legal gray area that could be interpreted unfavorably by the right prosecutor. Where is he? Jacob asked, his voice low. In the parlor with Emma. I didn't want to leave her alone with him, but Emid insisted on speaking with her. Ms. Wilson wrung her hands. He seems particularly interested in what she knows about her mother and the war. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. If this Pinkerton was investigating the mercy killings from the war, Emma's innocent comments about what her mother had told her could be disastrous. I'll handle this, he said, striding toward the parlor with determined steps. The man who rose as Jacob entered was the same figure he'd spotted watching him from across the street, tall and lean, with the sharp, observant eyes of someone accustomed to noticing details others missed. His dark coat was well cut, but showed signs of travel, and the badge he wore on his lapel confirmed Mrs. Wilson's identification. Dr. Jacob Reynolds, I presume, the man said, his voice calm and measured. I'm Detective Harold Pinkerton. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Emma sat on a small sofa near the window, her thin face pale but composed. She gave Jacob a small, reassuring smile that belied the seriousness of the situation. "What brings a territorial detective to Copper Creek, Mr. Pinkerton?" Jacob asked, keeping his tone conversational while positioning himself between the detective and Emma. "An ongoing investigation," Pinkerton replied, studying Jacob with uncomfortable intensity. "I've been tracking a series of suspicious deaths dating back to the war soldiers who died under questionable circumstances in field hospitals at Antietam and Gettysburg." Jacob's expression remained neutral through years of practice, though his pulse quickened. The war was a chaotic time. Many died under questionable circumstances, as you put it. "Indeed," Pinkerton agreed. "But I'm interested in a specific pattern: mortally wounded men who died more quickly than their injuries would suggest, often after being treated by a particular surgeon." His eyes never left Jacob's face. "A surgeon who was later discharged from the army under unusual circumstances." The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Jacob could feel Emma's concerned gaze on him, but didn't dare look at her, afraid of what his expression might reveal. "That was a long time ago, Detective," Jacob said carefully. "What does it have to do with Emma?" "Perhaps nothing," Pinkerton conceded. "Or perhaps everything. You see, I've also been investigating the death of Rebecca Lawson Sullivan, a death ruled an accident, despite considerable evidence suggesting otherwise." This caught Jacob off guard. "You think her death wasn't accidental?" "I think," Pinkerton said deliberately, "that Rebecca Lawson was a key witness to events during the war events that some would prefer remain buried. I think her knowledge made her dangerous to certain parties, and I think her daughter may possess information she doesn't even realize is significant." Emma spoke up, her voice stronger than Jacob expected. "Mama fell down the stairs. That's what Mr. Sullivan told everyone." Pinkerton turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly. "And do you believe that's what happened, Emma?" Emma's eyes flicked to Jacob, then back to the detective. "Mama was very sick at the end. She got confused sometimes, lost her balance. It could have been an accident." Jacob noted her careful phrasing, not a confirmation but not a denial either. Emma was protecting someone, but who? Sullivan out of fear, Rebecca out of loyalty, or was she perhaps protecting Jacob himself? "Why don't we continue this conversation another time?" Jacob suggested, moving to stand beside Emma. "Emma needs her rest, and I have patients to attend to." Pinkerton didn't appear offended by the dismissal. He simply nodded and retrieved his hat from a side table. "Of course, Doctor. But this investigation isn't going away. I'll be in town for some time, and we'll speak again at length." As he reached the parlor door, he paused, turning back. "One more thing, Dr. Reynolds. I understand you're seeking guardianship of Emma with the intention of taking her west. I'd advise against leaving Copper Creek until our business is concluded." The implied threat hung in the air even after Pinkerton had departed. Jacob sank onto the sofa beside Emma, suddenly exhausted. "Are you in trouble?" Emma asked quietly, her dark eyes studying his face with that unsettling perception. Jacob hesitated, torn between the instinct to shield her from worry and the knowledge that she deserved honesty. "I might be," he admitted finally. "Detective Pinkerton is investigating things that happened during the war, things your mother knew about." Emma nodded solemnly. "The soldiers you helped, the ones who were suffering too much to save." "Yes," Jacob confirmed, still amazed at how matter-of-factly she discussed such difficult moral territory. "Some people would call what I did wrong even criminal. Your mother understood, but others might not be so forgiving." "Is that why we need to go to the Valley of Souls?" Emma asked. "To hide from Detective Pinkerton?" Jacob shook his head. No, Emma. We're going there because it's what your mother wanted for you, and because I believe it's where you'll find the most peace for whatever time you have left. He took her small hand in his. But first, we need to make sure Sullivan can't prevent us from leaving. I've spoken with Mr. Harrison at the mining company, and he's arranging for me to become your legal guardian. Emma's face brightened. Really? So Mr. Sullivan can't make me go back with him? That's the idea, Jacob confirmed. The papers should be ready tomorrow. Until then, you'll stay here where it's safe. Emma's smile faded, her expression turning serious beyond her years. He'll be angry, you know. He doesn't like losing things he thinks belong to him. The phrasing sent a chill through Jacob. You don't belong to anyone, Emma. You're your own person. I know that, she said softly. But Mr. Sullivan doesn't. He thinks Mama belonged to him too, and when she tried to leave, she trailed off, her gaze distant. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Emma, did you see what happened to your mother the night she died? Emma looked down at their joined hands, her voice dropping to a whisper. I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard them arguing about me, about the money Mama had hidden. Mr. Sullivan was drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. Mama said she was taking me away, that she'd rather die than let him hurt me anymore. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. He said she could have her wish then. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her toward the stairs. She tried to catch herself on the railing, but she was so weak from the coughing. I heard her fall, heard the sound her head made when it hit the bottom step. Tears were sliding down Emma's pale cheeks now, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Sullivan saw me watching. He said if I ever told anyone what really happened, he'd do the same to me. He said no one would believe me anyway, that everyone knew Mama was sick and confused. Jacob pulled Emma gently into his arms, feeling her thin shoulders shake with silent sobs. Rage burned inside him, not the cold, controlled anger he'd felt in the alley, but something hotter and more primitive. Sullivan had murdered Rebecca and terrorized Emma into silence, all while positioning himself as the benevolent guardian to continue collecting the mining company's stipend. I believe you, Emma, Jacob said fiercely, and I promise you Sullivan will never hurt you again. Emma pulled back slightly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. You can't promise that. Not really. He always finds a way. The fatalism in her voice broke Jacob's heart. She had lived with fear for so long that safety seemed an impossible dream. This time will be different, Jacob insisted. Tomorrow, once the guardianship papers are signed, we'll begin preparations to leave for the valley. Sullivan won't be able to follow us there. Emma didn't argue, but the doubt in her eyes was clear. She had learned the hard way not to trust in promises of protection. As Jacob tucked her into bed later that evening, he found himself wondering if her skepticism was warranted. Sullivan, Pinkerton, the lingering mysteries of Rebecca's past, all were potential obstacles to fulfilling his promise. And even if they reached the valley, what then? Emma's consumption was advancing rapidly. There was no magic cure waiting in the mountains, no miracle that would save her life. But perhaps, Jacob reflected, that wasn't the point. Perhaps the journey itself, the act of honoring Rebecca's final wish and giving Emma a taste of freedom before the end, was what mattered most. With that thought in mind, he settled into the chair outside her door for another night of watchful vigilance, the weight of Rebecca's journal, a constant reminder of the promises made and the promises yet to be kept. The sound of breaking glass jolted Jacob from a fitful sleep. He leaped to his feet, disoriented for a moment, before the crash of splintering wood sent him lunging toward Emma's door. The room was in chaos, the window-shattered curtains billowing in the night breeze, and Emma's bed empty. A dark figure was halfway through the window, one arm clutching Emma's struggling form. "Sullivan!" Jacob roared, hurling himself across the room. He caught the man's shoulder just as he was about to pull Emma completely through the broken window. Sullivan turned, his face contorted with rage and desperation, and swung wildly with his free hand. The blow caught Jacob on the temple, sending him staggering back. "She's mine," Sullivan snarled. "The money's mine. You got no right." Emma fought like a wild creature, kicking and clawing at her captor. "Let me go, Dr. Reynolds, help!" Jacob recovered his balance and lunged again, this time catching Sullivan by the throat. The bigger man gurgled in surprise, his grip on Emma loosening just enough for her to wrench free and scramble back into the room. "Run, Emma!" Jacob shouted, struggling to maintain his hold as Sullivan's powerful arms flailed against him. "Get Mrs. Wilson!" Emma darted for the door, but Sullivan managed to hook a foot around her ankle, sending her crashing to the floor with a cry of pain. In the moment, Jacob's attention shifted to Emma. Sullivan broke free of his grasp and delivered a crushing blow to Jacob's ribs. Pain exploded through Jacob's side as he fell back against the wall. The breath knocked from his lungs. Sullivan was on him in an instant, hands closing around his throat, eyes wild with alcoholic fury. "You think you can take what's mine?" Sullivan hissed, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You think you're better than me, doctor? You ain't nothing but a murderer in fancy clothes." The words sent a shock through Jacob's system. How did Sullivan know about the Mercy killings? Had Pinkerton spoken to him, or was this knowledge from another source? Spots danced before Jacob's eyes as Sullivan's grip tightened. He clawed desperately at the bigger man's hands, but the lack of oxygen was quickly sapping his strength. In the periphery of his fading vision, he saw Emma struggle to her feet, saw her cast about frantically for a weapon. Then, with surprising speed for someone so ill, she grabbed the heavy ceramic water pitcher from the nightstand and brought it down on Sullivan's head with all her strength. The pitcher shattered, and Sullivan slumped forward momentarily, stunned. Jacob seized the opportunity, driving his knee up into Sullivan's solar plexus and shoving him backward. Sullivan crashed into the broken window glass shard, slicing into his arms as he struggled to regain his balance. "You little bitch!" He wheezed, blood streaming from a gash on his scalp where the pitcher had struck. His gaze locked on Emma with murderous intent. "Just like your mother, always fighting back when you should know your place." Jacob pushed himself to his feet, positioning himself between Sullivan and Emma, despite the searing pain in his ribs. "It's over, Sullivan. The mining company knows everything about the abuse, about how you've been misusing the stipend. By tomorrow, you'll have no legal claim to Emma." Sullivan's laugh was ugly, tinged with desperation. "You think papers change anything? You think I care about what's legal? She belongs with me. Rebecca promised." "Rebecca was trying to escape you," Jacob countered. "She was taking Emma away when you killed her." Sullivan's expression shifted, something like genuine grief flickering beneath the rage. "I didn't mean to. She was leaving, taking Emma, taking the money. After everything I'd done for them. After I saved her life." The pain in his voice gave Jacob pause. There was something more here, something beyond simple greed or cruelty. "What do you mean, you saved her life?" Sullivan's bloodshot eyes fixed on Jacob with sudden clarity. "Harrisburg, 1855. Lawson's Mill. Fire took the whole place, killed Rebecca's folks. I pulled her out, carried her through the flames. She promised she'd never leave. Said we were bound by fire and blood." A flash of recognition struck Jacob. He'd heard of the Lawson Mill fire. It had been notorious one of the deadliest industrial accidents of its time, and Sullivan had saved Rebecca. It added a layer of complexity to their relationship that Rebecca's journal hadn't fully conveyed. "That was a long time ago," Jacob said, his voice softening slightly. "People change. Promises get broken. It doesn't justify what you did to her or what you've done to Emma." "You don't understand," Sullivan insisted, swaying slightly as blood continued to seep from his head wound. "I loved her. Even when the war changed me, even when the drink took hold, I loved her. I never meant for her to fall. I just wanted her to stay." Emma, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "You pushed her. I saw you." Sullivan's gaze shifted to her, something like shame crossing his features. "It was an accident, Emma. You got to believe me. I never wanted your mama dead." "But you did want to hurt her," Emma said quietly. "You wanted to punish her for trying to leave, just like you punish me whenever I remind you of her." The simple truth of her words seemed to deflate Sullivan. He slumped against the window frame, the fight visibly draining from him. "She chose you over me," he muttered. "Always you. Never mind what I sacrificed, what I endured. She chose you." Before Jacob could respond, the door burst open. Mrs. Wilson stood there, a shotgun in her hands, with Dr. Montgomery right behind her. "Step away from the window, Sullivan, Mrs." Wilson ordered, the barrel of the shotgun unwavering. "The sheriff's on his way." Sullivan's eyes darted between the shotgun, Jacob, and Emma. For a moment, Jacob thought he might try to flee through the broken window. Instead, he straightened, a strange dignity suddenly evident despite his bloodied state. "Tell Morrison I'll be at the saloon," he said, his voice flat. "This ain't over, Reynolds. Not by a long shot." With that, he ducked through the window and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a room destroyed and questions multiplying in Jacob's mind. Montgomery rushed forward to examine Jacob and Emma for injuries while Mrs. Wilson kept watch at the window, shotgun ready. Jacob's ribs were badly bruised but not broken, and Emma had suffered only minor scrapes from her fall. "What in God's name was that about?" Montgomery demanded as he wrapped a bandage around Jacob's chest. "Sullivan's always been a mean drunk, but this is beyond the pale." Jacob exchanged a glance with Emma, who gave a small nod of permission. "Sullivan killed Rebecca," he said quietly. "Emma witnessed it. He's been threatening her to keep her silent, all while collecting the mining company's stipend meant for her care." Montgomery's eyes widened. "Good Lord, does Sheriff Morrison know?" "Would it matter if he did?" Mrs. Wilson asked bitterly, still watching the yard for any sign of Sullivan's return. "Morrison's in Sullivan's pocket, same as half the men in this town." "Maybe so," Montgomery conceded, "but murder is another matter entirely. Even Morrison couldn't ignore that, especially not with the mining company involved." Jacob wasn't so sure. Frontier justice was often more about convenience than truth, especially where influential men were concerned. Sullivan might face consequences for the break-in and assault, but without corroborating witnesses, Emma's testimony about her mother's death might not be enough. "We need to move up our timeline," Jacob decided, wincing as he pulled his shirt back on over the bandages. "Sullivan knows he's losing his claim on Emma. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. We can't wait for the guardianship papers to be finalized." "You're suggesting you leave tonight?" Montgomery asked, alarmed. "In your condition with Emma, as weak as she is?" "Not tonight," Jacob amended, "but tomorrow, as soon as Harrison has the preliminary papers ready. We don't need to wait for a judge's signature to put distance between Emma and Sullivan." Mrs. Wilson frowned. "And what about Detective Pinkerton? He made it clear he didn't want you leaving town." Jacob had almost forgotten about Pinkerton amid the chaos with Sullivan, but the detective's investigation posed its own threat. If Pinkerton was looking into the Mercy killings from the war, Jacob could face serious charges, possibly even hanging. Pinkerton is after information, not immediate arrests, Jacob reasoned. His focus seems to be on understanding what happened during the war and how it connects to Rebecca's death. Once we're safely away, I can correspond with him if necessary. Montgomery looked unconvinced. You're taking an awful risk, Reynolds. For a child, you barely know. Emma, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly reached out and took Jacob's hand. He knows me, she said with simple certainty. Mama said he would. The room fell silent at her words. There was something almost mystical in the conviction with which she spoke, as if Rebecca's belief in their fated meeting had transferred to her daughter. We'll leave tomorrow, Jacob confirmed, squeezing Emma's hand gently. Montgomery, can you arrange for horses and supplies? Mrs. Wilson will need provisions for the journey food that will keep medicines for Emma's symptoms. Both nodded, caught up in the urgency of Jacob's plan, despite their reservations. What about Sullivan? Mrs. Wilson asked. He'll try to stop you. Let me worry about Sullivan, Jacob said, his voice hardening. He's made his last attempt to harm Emma. As preparations began for their hasty departure, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Sullivan's desperate action spoke of more than just greed or possessiveness. There was a deeper history between him and Rebecca than the journal had revealed, a connection forged in fire and blood that had ultimately led to tragedy. And what of Pinkerton's investigation? The detective's interest in the Mercy killings and Rebecca's death suggested a broader conspiracy than Jacob had initially suspected. Was there more to Rebecca's role during the war than assisting with the morphine injections? Had she known something, witnessed something, that made her dangerous to someone besides Sullivan? These questions would have to wait. For now, Jacob's priority was getting Emma safely to the Valley of Souls, fulfilling Rebecca's final wish for her daughter. The rest, Sullivan, Pinkerton, the lingering mysteries of the past, would have to be addressed along the way. As dawn broke over Copper Creek, Jacob helped Emma pack her few belongings, including Rebecca's journal and the small photograph of the medical team at Antietam. They would leave as soon as Harrison delivered the guardianship papers, heading west toward a valley that might not even exist, except in Rebecca's fevered imagination. It was a desperate gamble, but Jacob had learned long ago that sometimes desperation was all one had to work with. Edward Harrison arrived at the boarding house shortly after noon, his normally composed features tight with concern as he took in the boarded window and Jacob's bruised face. I heard there was trouble last night, he said, handing Jacob a leather folder containing several official-looking documents. Sullivan, Jacob nodded quickly, scanning the papers. They were, as promised, a provisional guardianship agreement, pending judicial approval and authorization for the mining company's stipend to be redirected to Jacob for Emma's care. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. This will help immensely. Harrison glanced toward Emma, who was resting on a sofa in the parlor, her face pale but determined. Are you certain about this journey, Doctor? The girl looks in no condition to travel. The alternative is worse, Jacob said quietly. Sullivan won't stop trying to reclaim her, and Emma deserves better than to spend her final months in fear. Harrison nodded reluctantly. I understand. I've taken the liberty of adding a letter of introduction to colleagues in Sacramento. Should you encounter any difficulties along the way, they may be of assistance. Jacob tucked the additional paper into the folder with sincere thanks. Such connections could prove invaluable in the territories where official documentation wasn't always respected. What of Sullivan? He asked. Has there been any word? Harrison's expression darkened. He's been drowning his sorrows at the Golden Nugget since dawn. Sheriff Morrison spoke with him about the break-in, but made no arrest, claimed there was insufficient evidence despite Mrs. Wilson's testimony. Jacob wasn't surprised. Morrison's allegiance to Sullivan had been clear from the beginning. "We're leaving within the hour," he informed Harrison. "If Sullivan or Morrison comes looking for us afterward, I'll handle it," Harrison assured him. "The mining company has considerable influence in Copper Creek, Dr. Reynolds. More than a sheriff or a washed-up war hero, your departure will be facilitated." Jacob raised an eyebrow, wondering just how far Harrison's influence extended and what form this facilitation might take. But he didn't question it. Any advantage was welcome at this point. "And the detective?" Jacob asked. "Pinkerton." Harrison's face revealed nothing. "Detective Pinkerton is pursuing his own investigation independent of local concerns. I cannot intervene there." Which meant Jacob would need to deal with Pinkerton on his own terms if and when the detective caught up with them. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. "Thank you again, Mr. Harrison, for everything." As Harrison departed, Jacob turned his attention to final preparations. Montgomery had secured 2 horses, a sturdy gelding for Jacob, and a gentle mare for Emma, and Mrs. Wilson had packed provisions sufficient for several days' journey. Beyond that, they would need to rely on settlements along the way. Emma watched the activity with quiet anticipation, her dark eyes following Jacob's movements. When he knelt beside her sofa to check her temperature, she surprised him by reaching up to touch the bruise on his cheekbone where Sullivan had struck him. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked. "Not anymore," Jacob assured her, touched by her concern despite her own discomfort. "How about you? How's the breathing today?" Emma considered the question with a seriousness that belied her years. "Better than yesterday. The medicine Dr. Montgomery gave me helps." Montgomery had provided a generous supply of laudanum and other palliatives for the journey, though both physicians knew they were merely managing symptoms, not treating the underlying disease. Consumption followed its own inexorable course, regardless of medicines or climate. "We'll be leaving soon," Jacob told her. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this? We could wait another day if needed." Emma shook her head firmly. "No, we need to go now. I had a dream last night. Mama was in the valley waiting for us. She said we need to hurry." Jacob didn't know how to respond to this. He wasn't a superstitious man, but there had been too many coincidences, too many strange connections to dismiss Emma's dreams entirely. And what harm was there in honoring a dying child's belief that her mother awaited her in some special place? "Then we'll go," he said simply. "The horses are ready whenever you are." Emma's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds, brief but brilliant. "I'm ready now, Dr. Reynolds. I've been ready since Mama told me about the valley." As Jacob helped her don a warm coat borrowed from Mrs. Wilson, much too large but necessary for the mountain air, a commotion outside drew his attention. Voices were raised in the street, one of them unmistakably Sullivan's. "Reynolds!" the voice bellowed. "Bring her out. She's mine by right." Jacob moved quickly to the window, careful to stay out of sight as he peered through the curtains. Sullivan stood in the middle of the street, swaying drunkenly, a revolver clutched in his right hand. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Sheriff Morrison, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and the perpetually aggrieved expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Stay here," Jacob instructed Emma and Mrs. Wilson. "I'll handle this." Mrs. Wilson caught his arm. "He's armed and drunk, Doctor. Let the sheriff deal with him." "The sheriff is part of the problem," Jacob pointed out, checking his own revolver before tucking it into his belt. "I'll try to reason with them. If that fails..." He let the implication hang. Before Mrs. Wilson could protest further, Jacob stepped onto the boarding house porch. Sullivan spotted him immediately, raising the revolver with an unsteady hand. "There he is," Sullivan shouted. "The man who stole my ward, the murderer who thinks he's better than the rest of us." Sheriff Morrison placed a restraining hand on Sullivan's arm. "Put the gun down, Robert. This isn't helping your case." Jacob remained calm, his hands visible at his sides. "I haven't stolen anyone, Sullivan. The mining company has granted me provisional guardianship of Emma. It's all legal and documented." Sullivan spat in the dust. "Papers? What do I care for papers? She belongs with me. Rebecca promised." "Rebecca is dead," Jacob said evenly. "By your hand, according to Emma." This declaration caused a stir among the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance to watch the confrontation. Morrison's eyes narrowed, his hand moving subtly toward his own weapon. "That's a serious accusation, Doctor," the sheriff said. "You got any proof beyond a child's word?" "Rebecca's journal documents, Sullivan's abuse," Jacob replied. "And Emma witnessed him push her mother down the stairs during an argument about taking Emma away from him." Sullivan's face contorted with rage and something like despair. "Lies, all lies. Rebecca fell. She was sick, confused. I tried to save her." "Like you tried to save Emma last night," Jacob challenged, breaking into her room, trying to drag her through a window. Morrison looked genuinely startled at this. "Is that true, Robert? You broke into the boarding house." Sullivan waved the revolver erratically, causing several onlookers to duck for cover. "She's mine. The money's mine. Reynolds has no right." Jacob took a careful step forward, calculating the distance between them. Sullivan was drunk and emotional, making his aim unreliable, but at close range, even a drunkard could be deadly. "Emma is not property, Sullivan. She's a child who deserves care and comfort in the time she has left. The mining company agrees. So does Dr. Montgomery. You're the only one who can't see past your own selfishness." "Selfishness?" Sullivan's laugh was harsh, bordering on hysteria. "You know nothing about sacrifice, Doctor. Nothing about loyalty. I saved Rebecca from the fire. I gave her a home when no one else would. I took in her brat when her first husband died. And how am I repaid? With betrayal, with lies, with theft." The raw pain in his voice gave Jacob pause. There was genuine grief beneath Sullivan's rage, the anguish of a man who believed himself wronged by those he had tried, in his own twisted way, to protect. "Rebecca was grateful for what you did," Jacob said, softening his tone slightly. "But gratitude doesn't mean ownership, Sullivan. She had the right to leave when you became abusive. Emma has the right to be safe." Sullivan's revolver wavered, his bloodshot eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never meant to hurt her. Either of them. The drink, the memories. They twist everything. Make me see enemies where there are none." Jacob recognized the signs of a man on the verge of emotional collapse. Sullivan was dangerous in this state, unpredictable, vacillating between rage and remorse. But he was also vulnerable, perhaps even reachable. "I believe you," Jacob said carefully. "The war changed many of us, turned us into people we no longer recognize. But that doesn't excuse what you've done, Sullivan. It doesn't give you the right to hurt a child." For a moment, it seemed as if Jacob's words had gotten through. Sullivan's arm lowered slightly, his expression crumpling into something like realization. Then, from behind Jacob, Emma's voice called out, "Dr. Reynolds, the horses are ready." Sullivan's head snapped up, his gaze fixing on Emma standing in the boarding house doorway. Something dark and possessive flashed in his eyes, and the revolver came up again with sudden steadiness. "You're not taking her anywhere," he snarled. "If I can't have her, Neither can you. Time seemed to slow as Sullivan's finger tightened on the trigger. Jacob lunged forward, drawing his own weapon even as he shouted for Emma to get down. Sheriff Morrison, belatedly recognizing the danger, reached for Sullivan's arm. The shot cracked through the air like thunder, sending birds scattering from nearby rooftops. Jacob felt a burning sensation across his upper arm as the bullet grazed him, but his momentum carried him forward into Sullivan. They crashed to the ground together, Jacob's weight pinning the larger man as they struggled for control of the revolver. "Enough!" Morrison bellowed, finally drawing his own weapon and pointing it at the wrestling men. "The next one who moves gets a bullet." Jacob froze, acutely aware of Sullivan's revolver pressed between them, of the man's labored breathing, of the crowd's shocked murmurs. Slowly, carefully, he eased his weight off Sullivan, keeping a firm grip on the man's gun hand. "Take the weapon, Sheriff," Jacob instructed, his voice tight with controlled tension. Morrison hesitated only briefly before stepping forward and wrenching the revolver from Sullivan's grasp. "Robert Sullivan, I'm placing you under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder." Sullivan didn't resist as Morrison handcuffed him. All the fight seemed to have drained from him, leaving behind a shell of a man broken, defeated, his eyes fixed on some middle distance as if seeing ghosts. "She promised," he mumbled more to himself than anyone around him. "Fire and blood. She promised she'd never leave." As Morrison led Sullivan away, Jacob turned back to the boarding house, his heart pounding with the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her face ashen, Mrs. Wilson's protective arm around her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Jacob glanced at his arm where blood was seeping through his shirt sleeve. "Just a graze, nothing serious." He climbed the porch steps and knelt before Emma, checking her for any signs of shock or respiratory distress. The excitement could have triggered a coughing fit, potentially dangerous in her weakened state. "I'm all right," she assured him, though her breathing was slightly labored. "But we should go now while Mr. Sullivan is with the sheriff." Jacob nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion. Sullivan might be temporarily detained, but Morrison was unlikely to hold him long, not in Copper Creek, where loyalties ran deeper than law. Within minutes, their belongings were secured to the horses, and Jacob was helping Emma mount the gentle mare Montgomery had selected for her. Mrs. Wilson pressed a package of freshly baked bread into Jacob's hands, her eyes suspiciously bright. "God go with you both," she said, embracing Jacob briefly before turning to Emma. "And you, my brave girl, may you find the peace you deserve." Montgomery approached as they prepared to depart, his medical bag in hand. He quickly bandaged Jacob's arm, then handed him a small leather case. "Additional medicines," he explained, "and a letter to a colleague in Sacramento who specializes in consumption. He can't work miracles, but he might make the journey easier for Emma." Jacob tucked the case into his saddlebag with heartfelt thanks. "I owe you a debt I can't repay, William." Montgomery shook his head. "Consider it payment for old debts of my own. What you did during the war, the mercy you showed it, took a courage I lacked." Before Jacob could respond, a figure at the edge of the small crowd caught his attention. Detective Pinkerton stood watching, his expression unreadable as he tipped his hat in acknowledgement. The message was clear: their business remained unfinished. Jacob returned the gesture with a slight nod. He would deal with Pinkerton when the time came. For now, Emma's safety and comfort were all that mattered. With final farewells to Mrs. Wilson and Montgomery, Jacob mounted his horse, and they set off down Copper Creek's main street. Neither looked back at the town that had brought them together through a strange convergence of past connections and present needs. Ahead lay the mountains, and beyond them, if Rebecca's stories were true, a valley where wildflowers bloomed year-round and wounded souls could find peace. It was a slender hope, perhaps even a foolish one, but hope nonetheless. As they left the last buildings of Copper Creek behind, Emma straightened in her saddle, her face turned toward the western horizon. "We're really going," she said, wonder and trepidation mingling in her voice. "Yes," Jacob confirmed, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. "We're going to find your mother's valley." Emma's smile was tired but genuine. "She's waiting for us there. I can feel it." Jacob didn't contradict her. In a world where a dying nurse could somehow know her daughter would encounter a specific doctor years after her death, who was he to say what was possible or impossible? Perhaps Rebecca was waiting in some fashion, if not in body, then in the beauty of the place she had described with such longing. They rode in companionable silence as the sun began its slow descent toward the distant mountains. The terrain would grow more challenging in the days ahead, and Emma's condition would likely worsen, despite all Montgomery's medicines. But for this moment at least, there was peace, a respite between the dangers they had escaped and the challenges that awaited them. Neither could have guessed that Sullivan's desperate actions in Copper Creek were merely the prelude to a far more dangerous confrontation, or that Pinkerton's investigation would lead him to follow their trail with relentless determination. Nor could they have anticipated that the Valley of Souls would prove to be both more and less than Rebecca had described, a place of beauty and healing, yes, but also a final battleground where past and present would collide with devastating force. For now, though, they rode west, guided by the fading light, and the promise of a valley where wounded souls might find, if not salvation, then at least a measure of peace before the end. The western mountains rose before them like ancient sentinels, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Jacob and Emma had been traveling for 5 days, following the old Spanish trail that Rebecca had described in her journal. Their progress was slower than Jacob had hoped. Emma's strength waned with each passing day, her coughing fits growing more frequent and severe, despite the medicines Montgomery had provided. They had stopped for the night in a small clearing beside a stream, the horses grazing contentedly on the spring grass, while Jacob prepared a simple meal over the campfire. Emma sat wrapped in blankets against the evening chill, her thin face illuminated by the dancing flames, as she watched Jacob work. "Do you think we're close?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Jacob glanced up from the pot of rabbit stew he was stirring. "Your mother's journal mentioned 3 peaks that meet like fingers reaching for heaven. Those mountains ahead fit that description. If the valley exists, it should lie just beyond them." Emma nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "It exists. Mama wouldn't have lied about that." Jacob didn't argue, though, privately, he harbored doubts. Rebecca's descriptions of the Valley of Souls had grown increasingly detailed and passionate in her final journal entries, almost feverish in their intensity. Could they have been the product of consumption-induced delirium rather than actual memory? It was a possibility he couldn't dismiss yet, didn't have the heart to voice to Emma. "We should reach the pass tomorrow," he said instead, ladling stew into a tin bowl for her. "It'll be a difficult climb, but the horses are strong, and we'll take it slowly." Emma accepted the bowl with a grateful smile, though Jacob noticed she ate only a few spoonfuls before setting it aside. Her appetite had diminished alarmingly in recent days, another sign of her advancing illness. "Tell me about Sarah," she said suddenly. "You never talk about her." The request caught Jacob off guard. He had mentioned Sarah only briefly, since their journey began, finding the memories still too painful to share. But there was something in Emma's expression, a need for connection perhaps, or simply the desire to know more about the man who had become her protector, that made refusal impossible. "What would you like to know?" he asked, settling beside her with his own bowl of stew. "Was she beautiful?" Jacob smiled despite himself. "Very. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that could see right through you. But it wasn't just her appearance that made her beautiful. She had a way of finding joy in the smallest things: a wildflower by the road, a child's laughter, the first snow of winter." "Did you meet her during the war, like Mama met Mr. Sullivan?" "No," Jacob said, his gaze growing distant as he remembered. "We knew each other before. Grew up in the same town in Pennsylvania, actually. Childhood sweethearts, you might say. We were married just before I left for medical school. She waited for me through those years, and then through the war." Emma was silent for a moment, absorbing this. "And then she got sick, like me." It wasn't a question, but Jacob nodded anyway. "Yes, we'd only had a few years together after I returned from the war. It seemed so unfair to survive all that bloodshed, only to lose her to consumption." "Is that why you helped her die? Because you loved her too much to watch her suffer?" The directness of the question made Jacob's chest tighten, but he had long since stopped being surprised by Emma's perception and maturity. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "She was in so much pain at the end. The coughing never stopped, and she could barely breathe. One night, she begged me to help her find peace. So I did." Emma reached out and placed her small hand over his. "Mama said that's what love looks like sometimes. Doing the hard thing because it's the right thing." Jacob felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Rebecca's words, filtered through her daughter, seemed to offer absolution for a choice that had haunted him for years. "Your mother was a wise woman. She loved me like that too." Emma continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "She wanted to take me to the valley so I wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. So I could die in a beautiful place instead of in Mr. Sullivan's house, where everything was dark and angry." The simple way she spoke of her own death as an inevitability to be faced rather than feared broke Jacob's heart. Children Emma's age should be thinking of the future of possibilities and dreams, not preparing for their own mortality. "Emma," he began, unsure what comfort he could possibly offer. She turned to him with a small, serene smile. "It's all right, Dr. Reynolds. I'm not afraid anymore. Mama's waiting for me in the valley. And now you'll be with me too, so I won't be alone at the end like she was." Jacob pulled her gently against his side, mindful of her fragility. "You won't be alone," he promised. "Not for a single moment." They sat in silence, then watching the fire's embers glow against the gathering darkness. Above them, stars emerged one by one, brilliant against the vast canvas of the night sky. It was a peaceful moment, perhaps the most peaceful either had experienced in a long time, and Jacob found himself wishing it could last forever, this quiet communion under the stars, with a child who had somehow become so precious to him in such a short time. But as the night deepened and Emma finally drifted into sleep, Jacob remained awake, his mind troubled by thoughts of what lay ahead. Even if they found Rebecca's valley, it would not change the inexorable progression of Emma's disease. At best, it would provide a beautiful setting for her final days. At worst, the journey itself might hasten her decline. And then there were the threats that potentially followed behind them. Sullivan had been arrested in Copper Creek, but Jacob doubted the sheriff would hold him long. A man that desperate, that obsessed, would not be easily deterred. And Pinkerton, with his investigation into the wartime mercy killings, would he pursue them into the mountains? Or would the detective's interest end at the boundaries of civilization? Jacob stared into the dying fire, seeking answers in its fading light. He had spent 5 years running from his past, from the choices he had made, and their consequences. Now that past had caught up with him in ways he could never have anticipated, binding him to a dying child and a promise made to her mother beyond the grave. Whatever awaited them in the valley beyond the three peaks, Jacob knew with sudden certainty that his long journey of evasion was coming to an end. One way or another, he would have to face the ghosts that had haunted him since the war, since Sarah's death, and find either redemption or judgment in their reckoning. With that sobering thought, he added wood to the fire and settled in for a long night of vigilance, watching over Emma as she slept, and listening to the wind's whispers through the pines. The pass between the three peaks proved more challenging than Jacob had anticipated. The trail narrowed to little more than a goat path in places, winding precariously along sheer drops that plunged hundreds of feet to rocky ravines below. Emma, despite her weakness, remained determined, her eyes fixed ahead with a focus that belied her failing body. "We're close," she said, as they paused to rest the horses at midday. "I can feel it." Jacob studied her face, concerned by the heightened flush on her cheeks and the brightness of her eyes. Fever had taken hold that morning, and the altitude wasn't helping her already labored breathing. Montgomery's medicines could only do so much. The disease was advancing rapidly now, spurred perhaps by the exertion of travel. "Just a little further," Jacob agreed, helping her take small sips of water. "Then we'll rest properly." The truth was, he had no idea how much further they needed to go. Rebecca's journal had described the valley as lying beyond the 3 fingers of stone, where the ancient river carved a paradise from the mountain's heart. Poetic but frustratingly vague as practical directions, they continued their ascent, the trail growing steeper as they approached the highest point of the pass. Emma's breathing became increasingly labored, each breath a visible struggle that tore at Jacob's heart. He considered stopping making camp where they were, but something in Emma's determined expression kept him moving forward. It was late afternoon when they finally crested the pass. Jacob reined in his horse, momentarily stunned by the vista that opened before them. Below, nestled between the mountains like a jewel in a natural crown, lay a valley that could only be Rebecca's Valley of Souls. A river wound through its center like a silver ribbon flanked by meadows, ablaze with wildflowers of every color imaginable. Pine forests cloaked the lower slopes, giving way to open grasslands, and what appeared to be fruit orchards, remnants, perhaps, of an old Spanish mission or abandoned settlement. "It's real," Jacob breathed, scarcely believing his eyes. After days of harboring private doubts, the reality of the valley struck him with the force of revelation. Rebecca hadn't been delirious after all. She had known somehow impossibly about this hidden paradise. Emma's face transformed at the sight, joy breaking through the pallor of illness. "Mama was right," she whispered. "It's just like she described. The flowers, the river, everything." The trail descended gradually from the pass, switchbacking down the mountainside toward the valley floor. As they made their careful way down, Jacob couldn't help but marvel at the increasing abundance of wildflowers, lupines, columbines, Indian paintbrush, and dozens of varieties he couldn't name, carpeting the slopes in a riot of color despite the season. "How is this possible?" he wondered aloud. "These flowers shouldn't be blooming yet. It's barely spring." Emma smiled knowingly. "Mama said the valley has its own seasons. That's why she called it the Valley of Souls, because it follows different rules than the world outside." Jacob didn't quite know what to make of this explanation, but he couldn't deny the evidence before his eyes. The valley seemed to exist in a microclimate all its own, sheltered by the surrounding peaks, and warmed perhaps by hot springs, or some quirk of geography that created this pocket of perpetual spring. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the landscape. The beauty was almost otherworldly, the river glowing like molten silver, the mountains burning with alpenglow, the wildflowers closing their petals for the night. They made camp near a stand of cottonwood trees by the river, their branches creating a natural shelter. Emma's condition had deteriorated during the descent, and she now lay wrapped in blankets beside the fire Jacob had built, her breathing shallow and irregular. "We made it," Jacob told her, preparing a dose of Montgomery's strongest medicine. "We found your mother's valley." Emma nodded weakly, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. "I knew we would," she promised. Jacob helped her take the medicine, then dampened a cloth in the cool river water to lay across her fevered forehead. Her skin burned beneath his touch, and he recognized with medical certainty that the final stage of her illness had begun. Days, perhaps only hours, remained. The knowledge settled like a stone in his chest. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that reaching the valley might somehow slow the disease's progress, that the peaceful surroundings might ease Emma's suffering as Rebecca had believed. But consumption followed its own merciless schedule, indifferent to human hopes or scenic beauty. As darkness fell completely, Emma drifted into a fitful sleep, her breathing punctuated by the rattling cough that Jacob had come to dread. He sat beside her, monitoring her condition and occasionally adding wood to the fire, his mind filled with memories of Sarah's final days and the terrible choice he had made out of love and mercy. Would he face the same choice with Emma? The thought made his throat constrict with grief and fear. He had sworn to be with her until the end, to ensure she didn't die alone as Rebecca had. But he hadn't allowed himself to consider fully what that might entail. Rebecca's final journal entry echoed in his mind. "Show her the same mercy you showed those soldiers, the same mercy I wish someone had shown me." A request, or perhaps a command from beyond the grave. Jacob stared into the fire, wrestling with the moral implications. Was it mercy to hasten death when suffering became unbearable? Or was it an act of hubris, playing God with moments that weren't his to take? He had believed the former during the war and with Sarah, but those beliefs had cost him dearly: his position, his reputation, his peace of mind. Lost in these troubled thoughts, Jacob didn't immediately register the sound of approaching hoofbeats. By the time he did, it was too late to douse the fire or seek cover. He reached for his revolver just as a rider emerged from the darkness into the circle of firelight. "That won't be necessary, Dr. Reynolds," a familiar voice said. "I'm not here to arrest you. At least, not yet." Detective Harold Pinkerton dismounted with fluid grace, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He was travel-worn but composed, his sharp eyes taking in the Camp Emma's sleeping form and Jacob's defensive posture in one comprehensive glance. "How did you find us?" Jacob asked, not lowering his weapon. Pinkerton smiled thinly. "Following a man traveling with a dying child isn't particularly challenging even in these mountains. You left quite an impression at the last trading post." Jacob cursed silently. They had stopped for supplies 2 days ago at a remote outpost where the sympathetic trader had given Emma extra blankets at no charge. Of course, people would remember them, would talk about them to a detective with official credentials. "What do you want, Pinkerton?" Jacob demanded. "Emma doesn't have much time left. Whatever your investigation requires, can't it wait?" Pinkerton's gaze shifted to Emma, and something like genuine compassion flickered across his features. "I'm afraid it can't, Doctor. Events are moving more quickly than either of us anticipated." He nodded toward the darkness behind him. "We're not alone." Before Jacob could process this cryptic statement, another figure materialized at the edge of the firelight, a large bearded man whose bloodshot eyes reflected the flames with an almost feverish intensity. "Sullivan." Jacob breathed, his grip tightening on the revolver. Robert Sullivan looked even worse than when Jacob had last seen him in Copper Creek. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face covered in several days' growth of beard, and a wild desperation emanated from him like heat from a furnace. "I told you this wasn't over, Reynolds," Sullivan growled, swaying slightly where he stood. Despite his disheveled appearance, Jacob noted with alarm that he was armed, a revolver holstered at his hip, and a hunting knife visible in his boot. "How did you get out of jail?" Jacob asked, positioning himself between Sullivan and Emma's sleeping form. Sullivan's laugh was harsh, bordering on maniacal. "You'd think Morrison would keep me locked up. Man owes me his badge. Moment you and the girl were gone, he let me walk." His gaze shifted to Emma, something like hunger in his eyes. "She belongs with me. Always has." Pinkerton stepped forward, his own hand hovering near his weapon. "Mr. Sullivan agreed to lead me to you, Dr. Reynolds, in exchange for consideration regarding his own legal troubles. He was quite convinced you'd be heading for this valley." Jacob's mind raced. The detective and Sullivan had been traveling together. It made a certain twisted sense. Pinkerton needed to find Jacob, and Sullivan knew where they were going. But it was a dangerous alliance, particularly given Sullivan's unstable state. "Emma is dying," Jacob said bluntly. "She has hours, maybe days left. What possible purpose could either of you have in disturbing her final moments?" "Justice," Pinkerton replied simply. "Retribution," Sullivan snarled at the same time. The contradiction between their answers wasn't lost on Jacob. Whatever temporary alliance these two men had formed, their ultimate goals clearly differed. "Justice for what?" Jacob challenged Pinkerton. "The Mercy killings during the war that was 17 years ago." "Not just for them," Pinkerton said, "though they're part of it. I'm also investigating Rebecca Sullivan's death, which I now have reason to believe was no accident." Sullivan's face contorted with rage. "You shut your mouth about Rebecca. You don't know nothing about it." "I know Emma witnessed you push her mother down the stairs," Jacob countered, watching Sullivan carefully for any sudden movements. "I know you've been terrorizing a dying child to keep her silent." Sullivan took a menacing step forward, stopped only by Pinkerton's restraining hand on his arm. "Rebecca was mine," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "From the day I pulled her from that fire, she was mine. We had a bond fire and blood, she called it. But then the war came." His glare shifted to Jacob. "Then she met people like him, doctors who thought they knew better than God when someone should die." The pieces suddenly clicked into place in Jacob's mind. "You knew," he said softly. "You knew about the Mercy killings all along. That's why you hated Rebecca, because she assisted me." Sullivan's eyes blazed in the firelight. "She told me everything when the consumption fever took hold. How she helped you prepare the morphine. How she held the soldiers' hands while they died. She thought I'd understand, that I'd help her the same way when her time came." His voice broke. "As if I could ever harm a hair on her head." The irony of this statement, given what Emma had witnessed, wasn't lost on Jacob. But he was beginning to understand the complex tangle of love, possession, and moral outrage that had driven Sullivan to violence. "So instead you let her suffer," Jacob said. "You watched her drown in her own lungs rather than grant her the release she begged for." "It wasn't my place," Sullivan roared. "Nor yours. Who are we to decide when someone dies? That's for God alone." Pinkerton, who had been observing this exchange with keen interest, finally spoke. "That's the crux of my investigation, Dr. Reynolds. Not just the legality of what you did during the war, but the moral question it raises. Who has the right to end a life even out of mercy?" A soft voice from behind Jacob interrupted the tense standoff. I think the person who's suffering has that right. All three men turned to see Emma sitting up, her blankets clutched around her shoulders. Despite her weakness, her dark eyes were clear and focused. "Emma," Jacob said, moving quickly to her side, "you should be resting." She shook her head slightly. "Not yet. There are things that need to be said first." Her gaze shifted to Sullivan, who had gone very still at the sight of her. "Hello, Mr. Sullivan." Sullivan's expression underwent a remarkable transformation, the rage giving way to something almost tender. "Emma," he said, his voice barely audible, "you look so much like her." "Like Mama," Emma agreed. "That's why you hate me, isn't it? Because I remind you of her, but I'm not her." Sullivan flinched as if struck. "I don't hate you, girl. Never did." "You burned me with cigarettes," Emma said matter-of-factly. "You starved me and told me I was bad inside because I was dying like Mama." The brutal simplicity of her accusation hung in the air. Sullivan seemed to shrink before their eyes, the manic energy draining from him. "I was angry," he whispered. "So angry. At her for leaving. At you for being sick. At myself for—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "For pushing her," Emma finished for him. "For killing her when she tried to take me away." Sullivan's face crumpled. "It was an accident. I swear to God, Emma, I never meant for her to fall. I just wanted her to stay." Pinkerton's attention had sharpened visibly during this exchange. "You're confessing to causing Rebecca Sullivan's death?" he asked, his tone professionally neutral, despite the gravity of the moment. Sullivan didn't seem to hear the detective. His focus remained entirely on Emma, his expression haunted. "She wanted me to help her, die like Reynolds helped those soldiers. Said the pain was too much, that she couldn't bear it anymore. But I couldn't do it. Couldn't take her life even out of mercy." A sob escaped him. "So she was going to leave, take you to this valley where she said death would be easier. We argued. I was drunk. I grabbed her arms and then—" He shook his head, tears streaming into his beard. "I've seen her every night since in my dreams, standing at the bottom of those stairs looking up at me with such disappointment." Emma's expression softened unexpectedly. "Mama forgave you, you know. Before she died, when I was holding her hand, she told me to tell you she understood why you couldn't help her. She said you were a good man once before the war broke something inside you." Sullivan stared at her in disbelief. "She said that after what I did—" Emma nodded. "She also made me promise to find this valley and to bring her journal here. She said it belonged in this place where wounded souls find peace." Jacob was struck by the maturity and compassion in Emma's voice, the absence of bitterness or accusation, despite all she had suffered at Sullivan's hands. She spoke with her mother's wisdom, as if channeling Rebecca's understanding from beyond death. Pinkerton cleared his throat, visibly moved, despite his professional demeanor. "This journal, does it contain details about the mercy killings during the war?" "Yes," Jacob answered for Emma. "Rebecca assisted me with several cases, soldiers with mortal wounds who were suffering unnecessarily. She documented some of it along with her own experiences during and after the war." "I'll need to see this journal," Pinkerton said. "It's vital evidence in my investigation." Emma's gaze shifted to Jacob. "Show him Dr. Reynolds. Mama would want the truth to be known, whatever the consequences." With reluctant hands, Jacob retrieved Rebecca's journal from his saddlebag and handed it to Pinkerton. The detective accepted it solemnly, seeming to understand the significance of what he was being entrusted with. "I'll treat it with respect," he promised. "Whatever my investigation concludes, I recognize the complexity of what happened both during the war and after." Sullivan had been watching this exchange with growing agitation. "The journal was meant for Emma," he protested. "Rebecca left it for her, not for some lawman to use against her memory." "Mama left it for the truth," Emma corrected gently. "And the truth belongs to everyone, Mr. Sullivan." A sudden coughing fit seized her, more violent than any before. Blood spattered the blanket as she doubled over her thin frame, shaking with the effort to breathe. Jacob was at her side, instantly supporting her as the spasm passed. When she leaned back against him exhausted, he could hear the fluid rattling in her lungs with each shallow breath. The end was very near now. "She needs rest," he told the other men firmly. "Whatever else needs to be said can wait until morning." Sullivan stepped forward, his expression anguished. "Let me sit with her. Please, I owe her that much." Jacob's instinct was to refuse to protect Emma from the man who had caused her so much suffering. But to his surprise, Emma nodded weakly. "It's all right," she whispered to Jacob. "He needs to be here too, for Mama's sake." Jacob hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "You can stay, Sullivan, but I'll be watching you." Sullivan sank to his knees beside Emma's makeshift bed, his large hands awkward and uncertain as they hovered near her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything. Your mama deserved better. You deserved better." Emma's smile was fragile but genuine. "I know," she said simply. Then, with effort, she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small folded paper. "Mama wrote this for you the night before she died. I was supposed to give it to you, but I was afraid." Sullivan accepted the paper with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. As he read, tears coursed freely down his weathered cheeks. When he finished, he pressed the letter to his heart, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jacob glanced questioningly at Emma, who whispered, "She told him she forgave him for not being able to help her die, and she asked him to let me go when the time came to find you and the valley." The revelation stunned Jacob. Had Rebecca truly foreseen all of this, Jacob finding Emma, their journey to the valley, even Sullivan's eventual arrival? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence suggested a prescience that defied rational explanation. Pinkerton, who had been observing from a respectful distance, approached Jacob quietly. "I think it would be best if we continued our discussion away from Miss Emma," he suggested. "Let her rest with Sullivan keeping watch." Jacob was reluctant to leave Emma with Sullivan despite her apparent forgiveness of the man, but Pinkerton's firm grip on his arm gave him little choice, and he allowed himself to be led away from the campfire toward the riverbank. "You're planning to arrest me," Jacob said once they were out of earshot. "For the Mercy killings." Pinkerton sighed, gazing out at the moonlit water. "That was my original intention when I began this investigation, yes. The law is clear on such matters. Ending a life, even out of compassion, is legally homicide." "And now?" Jacob pressed. The detective was silent for a long moment. "Now I'm not so certain. This case has proven more complex than I anticipated. The lines between right and wrong mercy and murder justice and cruelty, they've become increasingly blurred the deeper I've delved." He turned to face Jacob directly. "I've interviewed dozens of witnesses over the past year, nurses, orderlies, other surgeons who served with you. Almost without exception, they spoke of your actions not as crimes, but as acts of profound compassion in impossible circumstances. Even those who disagreed with your methods acknowledged the purity of your intentions." Jacob was taken aback. He had assumed Pinkerton's investigation was a straightforward pursuit of legal justice, not a philosophical inquiry into the nature of mercy. "What about Sullivan?" he asked. "He just confessed to causing Rebecca's death." Indeed he did, Pinkerton agreed, and he'll face justice for that. But even there, the waters are muddied by circumstance and intent. Was it murder or a tragic accident born of emotional distress? A court will have to decide. Jacob glanced back toward the campfire where Sullivan sat beside Emma, his head bowed. And what about Emma? What justice is there for her suffering? Pinkerton's expression softened. Sometimes justice takes forms we don't expect, Dr. Reynolds. From what I've witnessed tonight, Emma has found a kind of peace that the law could never provide: understanding, forgiveness, closure. She's dying, Jacob said bluntly. Within hours, most likely. What peace can there be in that? Perhaps more than you or I can comprehend, Pinkerton replied. She found her mother's valley. She confronted the man who harmed her and found the strength to forgive him. And she has you, someone who cares for her deeply despite having known her only briefly. Jacob couldn't argue with this assessment. There was a serenity about Emma that transcended her physical suffering, a wisdom beyond her years that suggested she had indeed found some measure of peace in this hidden valley. What happens now? He asked Pinkerton. With your investigation, I mean. The detective considered the question carefully. I'll take Rebecca's journal as evidence. It may provide context that changes how the legal system views both your actions during the war and Sullivan's role in her death. As for arrests, he hesitated. Let's just say my report will emphasize the moral complexity of the situation. Justice doesn't always require punishment, Dr. Reynolds. Sometimes it requires understanding. Relief washed over Jacob, though he was careful not to show it too openly. And Emma, will you allow her to remain here in her mother's valley for whatever time she has left? Of course, Pinkerton said, sounding almost offended at the suggestion he might do otherwise. I'm an officer of the law, doctor, not a monster. The girl deserves dignity in her final hours. They returned to the campfire to find Sullivan still sitting beside Emma, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. The big man looked up as they approached his face, haggard with grief and exhaustion. She's worse, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The breathing's getting harder. Jacob knelt to examine Emma, his physician's training confirming what Sullivan had observed. The rattling in her lungs had increased, and her breathing was now shallow and irregular. Her skin burned with fever despite the cool night air. It won't be long now, Jacob said quietly. Hours at most. Sullivan's face crumpled. Can't you do something? Give her medicine, ease the pain somehow. The irony of Sullivan asking for the very intervention he had denied Rebecca wasn't lost on Jacob. I've given her everything Montgomery provided, he replied. It's helping with the pain, but it can't stop the disease's progression. What about? Sullivan couldn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Jacob studied the man who had been his adversary, seeing in his anguished expression a mirror of his own moral struggle. Are you asking me to help her die, Sullivan? To show her the mercy you couldn't show Rebecca? Sullivan flinched at the directness of the question, but he didn't look away. I'm asking you to do whatever is necessary to prevent her suffering, he said finally, even if it's something I couldn't do myself. The admission clearly cost Sullivan dearly. It was a surrender of his moral certainty, an acknowledgement that his previous absolutism might have been wrong. Jacob glanced at Pinkerton, who had been listening to this exchange with a carefully neutral expression. And what would the law say about that detective? Pinkerton sighed heavily. The law is clear, as I've said, but I've also learned that there are places where the law cannot reach moments of private conscience that exist beyond its jurisdiction. He gestured to the surrounding valley. Perhaps this is such a place. I didn't see it on any map. It was as close to permission as a lawman could give. Jacob nodded, understanding the unspoken agreement between them. I'll do what's best for Emma, he said simply, whatever that may be. The three men settled around the fire in silent vigil as the night deepened. Emma slept fitfully, occasionally waking with coughing spasms that left her gasping and weak. Jacob administered Montgomery's medicines as needed, but they both knew it was merely palliative care, now not treatment. During one period of lucidity, Emma beckoned Jacob closer. "Is it morning yet?" she whispered. "Almost," he told her, though dawn was still hours away. "The stars are beginning to fade." She smiled faintly. "Good. Mama said the valley is most beautiful at sunrise. That's when the souls gather in the meadow." Jacob stroked her fevered brow, his heart aching. "Would you like to see the meadow at sunrise, Emma?" She nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation despite her weakness. "More than anything." "Then we'll make sure you do," he promised. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Jacob carefully wrapped Emma in blankets and lifted her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body consumed by illness, until she was little more than spirit, enclosed in the most fragile of vessels. Sullivan and Pinkerton followed as Jacob carried Emma from the campsite toward a meadow they had passed the previous evening, a wide expanse carpeted with wildflowers that faced the eastern mountains. It was the perfect place to watch the sunrise. Jacob settled with Emma in his arms at the meadow's edge, positioning her so she could see the sky gradually brightening above the jagged peaks. Sullivan knelt beside them, his large frame somehow diminished by grief and remorse. Pinkerton remained standing a few paces behind, a respectful witness to the unfolding scene. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered as the first golden rays of sunlight crested the mountains, illuminating the valley in a warm glow. The wildflowers around them seemed to open in response, their petals turning toward the light like countless tiny faces. "Yes," Jacob agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Beautiful." Emma's breathing had grown more labored, each inhalation a visible struggle. Her eyes, however, remained clear and focused on the spectacular sunrise unfolding before them. "I can see her," she said suddenly, her voice gaining strength for a moment. "Mama's there, in the meadow. She's wearing her blue dress, the one from before she got sick. She's smiling." Jacob exchanged glances with Sullivan, who looked stricken. Was this delirium the hallucination of a dying brain, or something else? Something beyond rational explanation. "She's not alone," Emma continued, her gaze fixed on a point in the meadow that appeared empty to the men. "There's a woman with golden hair standing beside her. She has your eyes, Dr. Reynolds." Jacob felt a chill run through him. He had never described Sarah's appearance to Emma in such detail. How could she know about the golden hair, Sarah? He whispered half to himself. Emma smiled. "She says she's proud of you, that you did the right thing even when it was hard. She says love sometimes means letting go." Tears streamed freely down Jacob's face now. He didn't know if he believed in ghosts or visions or life beyond death. But in this moment, in this valley that seemed to exist outside normal rules, he found himself wanting to believe that Emma truly saw what she described. "They're waiting for me," Emma said, her voice growing fainter. "In the meadow, where the wildflowers never die." Sullivan reached out a trembling hand to touch her arm. "Emma, his voice broke. "Tell your mama I'm sorry. For everything." Emma's gaze shifted to him, compassion in her eyes despite her suffering. "She knows, Mr. Sullivan. She's forgiven you already." A violent coughing spasm seized her, then worse than any before. Blood flecked her lips as she fought for breath, her small body arching in Jacob's arms. When the spasm passed, she lay exhausted, her breathing shallow and erratic. "It hurts," she whispered. "Dr. Reynolds, it hurts so much." Jacob knew it was time for the choice he had been dreading, the same choice he had faced with Sarah, with those mortally wounded soldiers. He reached into his medical bag and withdrew a small brown bottle and syringe. Sullivan watched him with anguished understanding. Will she suffer?" "No," Jacob assured him, his hands steady despite the emotion coursing through him. "She'll simply fall asleep. No more pain, no more struggling to breathe." Sullivan nodded, tears streaming unchecked into his beard. "Do it then, for mercy's sake." Jacob prepared the morphine with practiced movements, the routine familiar from his days as a surgeon and from Sarah's final night. As he filled the syringe with the carefully measured dose enough to ease pain, enough to slow breathing beyond recovery, he was acutely aware of Pinkerton observing from behind them. The detective made no move to interfere his silence, an eloquent acknowledgment of the moral territory they had entered. "Emma," Jacob said gently, "this medicine will make the pain stop. You'll feel sleepy, and then you'll dream of the meadow and your mother." Emma's eyes found his understanding dawning in their depths. "Like you did for the soldiers," she said. "Like you did for Sarah." "Yes," Jacob admitted. "Like that." A smile of profound relief crossed her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Mama was right about you. You understand mercy." Jacob administered the injection with gentle precision, his physician's training ensuring the morphine entered her bloodstream smoothly. Then he cradled her in his arms as the powerful opiate began to take effect, easing the pain that had been her constant companion for so long. "The meadow is so bright now," Emma murmured, her eyelids growing heavy. "The flowers are every color imaginable. Mama's walking toward me, with her arms outstretched." Sullivan made a choked sound beside them, his large frame shaking with silent sobs. Jacob continued to hold Emma, watching as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened, the terrible rattling finally subsiding. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, the words barely audible. "Not with you here, and Mama waiting." Her eyes drifted closed, her body relaxing as the morphine carried her beyond pain. Jacob monitored her pulse, feeling it weaken and slow beneath his fingertips. Sullivan reached out to take her small hand in his, as if offering what comfort he could for the journey she was undertaking. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the meadow in golden light. Wildflowers swayed gently in the morning breeze, their sweet scent filling the air. It was, Jacob thought, as perfect a place as any to cross from one world to the next. "She's gone," he said softly, as Emma's pulse faded beneath his touch, and her chest rose and fell one final time. Sullivan bowed his head, his shoulders heaving with grief. Pinkerton removed his hat in a gesture of respect, his normally impassive face showing genuine sorrow. Jacob continued to hold Emma's body, reluctant to break the connection just yet. In the brief time he had known her, this remarkable child had changed him profoundly, had brought him from aimless wandering to purposeful action, had led him to confront his past rather than flee from it. "What now?" Sullivan asked eventually, his voice raw with emotion. "We bury her here," Jacob replied, "in the valley as Rebecca wished, with her mother's journal, so they remain connected in some way." Pinkerton stepped forward. "I'll need to document portions of the journal first for my report, but afterward, yes, it should remain with Emma." They worked together through the morning, Jacob and Sullivan digging a grave in a spot overlooking the meadow, while Pinkerton carefully copied relevant passages from Rebecca's journal. It was strange, Jacob reflected, how circumstances had transformed them from adversaries into reluctant allies, united by their connection to Emma and her mother. By midday, they were ready. Emma's body, wrapped in blankets, was lowered gently into the earth. Jacob had fashioned a simple wooden marker with her name and the words, "Beloved daughter, brave soul." As they stood around the grave in the noonday sun, Jacob was struck by the absence of traditional religious words or rituals. None of them were men of formal faith, their experiences in war and its aftermath having complicated their relationships with conventional religion. Instead, Sullivan spoke of Rebecca, of her kindness, her strength, her love for Emma. Jacob shared memories of Emma's courage and wisdom beyond her years, and Pinkerton, somewhat to Jacob's surprise, offered a reflection on the nature of justice and mercy that suggested the detective's investigation had become a deeply personal spiritual journey. When the grave was filled and the marker set in place, the three men stood in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The valley around them continued its timeless rhythms, the river flowing, wildflowers turning toward the sun, birds calling from the pines. "I'll be leaving for Sacramento tomorrow," Pinkerton said finally. "My investigation requires me to file reports, though, as I mentioned, they will reflect the complexity of what I've witnessed here." Jacob nodded, grateful for the detective's unexpected understanding. "And Sullivan," Pinkerton's gaze shifted to the larger man. "Mr. Sullivan has confessed to causing Rebecca Lawson's death, regardless of whether it was intentional. He'll need to return with me to face legal proceedings." Sullivan didn't protest or attempt to flee. He simply nodded, a man finally ready to accept the consequences of his actions. "It's right," he said quietly. "I've run from the truth too long." "And you, Dr. Reynolds?" Pinkerton asked. "Will you be returning to civilization as well?" Jacob looked around at the valley, at its serene beauty, its isolation from the world's complexities. For 5 years he had wandered without purpose, haunted by his past. Now, standing beside Emma's grave, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle had closed. "No," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I think I'll stay here at least for a while. Someone should tend Emma's grave, and perhaps there's healing to be found in this place for wounded souls like mine." Pinkerton nodded, seeming to understand. "The valley doesn't appear on any maps. As far as the official record is concerned, you could disappear here quite effectively." It was as close as the lawman would come to saying Jacob was free from prosecution for the Mercy killings, that in this unmapped valley the long arm of the law would not reach him. "What will you tell your superiors?" Jacob asked. Pinkerton smiled slightly. "That my investigation led to the resolution of a suspicious death case, Rebecca Lawson's, but that the principal subject of my inquiry into wartime medical practices was found to have died several years ago. Not entirely untrue in a sense. The man you were during the war is not the man standing before me now." Jacob was moved by this unexpected act of compassion from a man sworn to uphold the letter of the law. "Thank you," he said simply. Sullivan, who had been staring at Emma's grave marker, suddenly spoke. "I'd like to leave something for her. A gift before I go to face what's coming." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a wildflower meticulously detailed despite having been carved with just a pocket knife. He placed it gently atop the grave. "I made these for Rebecca when we were young," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Before the war, before the drinking, before everything went wrong. Emma should have something of the man I used to be, not just the monster I became. The gesture was unexpectedly poignant, a glimpse of the person Sullivan might have been had life and war not broken him. Jacob felt a complicated mixture of emotions, lingering anger at what this man had done to Emma and Rebecca, but also a reluctant understanding of how suffering could transform a person beyond recognition. "She forgave you," Jacob reminded him. "At the end, she forgave you. Try to remember that in the days ahead." Sullivan nodded, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. "I don't deserve it, but I'll try to live the rest of my life, whatever's left of it, after justice is done, in a way that honors that forgiveness." As the afternoon waned, Pinkerton and Sullivan prepared to depart, gathering their horses and supplies for the journey back through the mountain pass. Jacob walked with them to the valley's edge, feeling a strange reluctance to see them go, despite their complex shared history. "Will you be all right here alone?" Pinkerton asked, as they prepared to mount. "Winter will come, eventually, even to this sheltered place." Jacob smiled, gazing back at the valley with its flowing river and meadows of wildflowers. "I've been alone for 5 years, Detective, but here I don't feel quite so solitary." Whether it was the natural beauty of the place, the presence of Emma's grave giving purpose to his days, or some ineffable quality Rebecca had sensed when she called it the Valley of Souls, Jacob couldn't say. But he felt more at peace than he had since before the war, since before Sarah's illness. "If you ever wish to return to the world," Pinkerton said, handing Jacob a folded paper, "this contains my contact information. I would be interested to hear how your story continues." Jacob accepted the paper with a nod of thanks. "And I would be interested to know the outcome of Sullivan's case when the time comes." The men shook hands, a gesture that would have seemed impossible just days before, and then Pinkerton and Sullivan mounted their horses and began the ascent toward the mountain pass. Jacob watched until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, then turned back toward the valley that had become his unexpected sanctuary. The sun was beginning its western descent, casting long shadows across the landscape. Jacob made his way to Emma's grave, sitting beside it, as the day's heat gradually gave way to the cooler air of evening. He thought of the journey that had led him here from the blood-soaked fields of Antietam to Sarah's deathbed, through years of aimless wandering to a chance encounter with a child who needed his protection. Had Rebecca somehow engineered it all from beyond the grave? Had fate or providence guided their paths to intersect? Or was it simply the random collision of wounded souls seeking healing in a world that offered too little mercy? Jacob didn't know, and perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that Emma had found peace in her final moments, that Sullivan might find redemption through justice and remorse, that Pinkerton had discovered the limitations of law when confronted with the complexities of human suffering. And Jacob himself, he had found, if not absolution, then at least understanding of his past actions, of the nature of mercy, of the thin line between helping and harming that every healer must walk. As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared above the valley, Jacob built a small fire near Emma's grave. The flames reminded him of the campfire where he and Emma had sat that first night in the valley discussing Sarah and the nature of love and sacrifice. "You were right, Emma," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear. "About Sarah being proud. About love sometimes meaning letting go. I think I understand that now." The fire crackled in response, sending sparks upward into the night sky. Around him, the valley settled into the peaceful rhythms of evening, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant splash of the river, the whisper of wind through the pines. In this place, Rebecca had promised wounded souls could find peace. Jacob didn't know if he believed in souls or an afterlife where Emma and Rebecca and Sarah might somehow exist together. But he believed in this moment, in this valley, in the healing that comes from facing one's past rather than running from it. For now, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, practical concerns of shelter and food for the coming seasons, the emotional work of processing all that had happened, decisions about whether to remain in the valley indefinitely or eventually return to the world. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, Jacob Reynolds, once a battlefield surgeon, once a grieving husband, once a drifter without purpose, allowed himself to simply to breathe, to remember, to begin, at last, to heal. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the valley, across the river, and the meadows, the pines, and the wildflowers, the grave of a child who had changed so many lives in her brief time on earth. And in that gentle illumination, Jacob thought he glimpsed, just for a moment, 3 figures walking among the flowers: a woman with auburn hair, a child with wise dark eyes, and Sarah, her golden hair shining in the moonlight, her hand extended in a gesture of welcome and forgiveness. Whether vision or memory or wishful thinking, it brought a smile to Jacob's face and peace to his troubled heart. In the Valley of Souls, where the rules of the outside world held no sway, perhaps such things were possible after all.